Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There is something appropriate about marking our temporal and spatial coordinates before discussing entities that exist beyond both, and the question of what might exist beyond even those entities. We are about to investigate one of cosmic horror's most destabilizing questions, not who the outer gods are, but what controls them, what hierarchies extend above the hierarchies we think we understand, and whether the very concept of control retains meaning at scales where consciousness itself becomes optional. This is not a question Lovecraft definitively answered in his fiction, and perhaps could not answer without betraying the philosophical foundations of cosmic horror itself. Yet the question haunts his work, appears in fragments and implications, surfaces in the spaces between his named entities and the unnamed forces those entities supposedly serve. This documentary traces the literary, philosophical, and psychological dimensions of a question that may be unanswerable in principle. If the outer gods, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, occupy the apex of cosmic power, what occupies the space above the apex? Or does the question itself reveal a category error, a human compulsion to impose hierarchies on a cosmos that operates without them? We will examine Lovecraft's careful construction of cosmic ambiguity, the philosophical traditions that prepared audiences to ask such questions, and why nearly a century later we remain disturbed by the possibility that ultimate power might be unconscious, that cosmic sovereignty might be illusion, or that the answer to who controls might be more horrifying than any entity Lovecraft ever named. You are already complicit in asking questions that may have no safe answers. Let us proceed. Howard Phillips Lovecraft's construction of cosmic hierarchies during the 1920s and 1930s represents a deliberate philosophical project rather than mere fantasy world-building. Unlike authors who created pantheons for mythological completeness or narrative convenience, Lovecraft used hierarchical structures to explore specific questions about power, consciousness, and cosmic order in a mechanistic universe. His letters from this period reveal conscious attention to the problem of ultimate authority, whether any entity could meaningfully be called supreme in an infinite cosmos, whether consciousness conferred power or merely created the illusion of control, and whether the human need for cosmic hierarchies reflected reality or merely projected anthropocentric assumptions onto indifferent nature. Lovecraft wrote to Clark Ashton Smith in 1927 about wanting to create entities that dwarf all previously conceived gods, not through greater power in conventional sense, but through existing at scales where power itself becomes a meaningless category. The project aimed at constructing not a complete cosmology, but rather a cosmology that gestured toward its own incompleteness, that suggested levels beyond its explicit structure. The deliberate construction of a pantheon beyond pantheons emerged gradually across Lovecraft's mature work as he moved from localized horrors to cosmic architecture. Early stories like The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, introduced powerful entities but positioned them as ancient beings within Earth's history rather than as cosmic principles. The progression toward truly cosmic scope accelerated with The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1926-1927, where Randolph Carter discovers that Earth's gods serve other gods dwelling in outer voids, and those gods themselves answer to entities like Azathoth dwelling at Chaos's center. Yet even at this apparent apex, Lovecraft's texts include suggestive fragments about forces beyond or behind the named entities. A 1929 letter to August Derleth mentions the ultimate chaos which bubbles and blasphemes at the center of infinity, but deliberately avoids definitively stating whether this chaos controls or merely exists, whether it represents absolute beginning or just another level in infinite regression. The progression demonstrates Lovecraft's awareness that cosmic horror's effectiveness depends on maintaining questions rather than resolving them. Lovecraft placed entities above his gods specifically to subvert every reassuring aspect of traditional religious hierarchies. Conventional theology positions conscious, intentional, morally concerned deity at reality's apex, a being who knows, cares, judges, and maintains cosmic order according to principles humans can theoretically understand even if they cannot fully grasp them. Lovecraft systematically inverted each comfort. His supreme entity, Azathoth, possesses no consciousness. His omniscient entity, Yog-Sothoth, demonstrates no concern for human welfare. His active agent, Nyarlathotep, serves purposes so alien that intention itself becomes questionable category. Yet the inversion goes deeper. By suggesting forces beyond even these entities, Lovecraft removes the consolation of knowing where the hierarchy ends. Religious cosmology offers comfort partly through completeness. However terrible God's judgments, at least he represents final authority beyond which no appeal exists. Lovecraft denies this closure, suggesting that every apparent ultimate authority merely serves as mask for deeper, stranger forces that themselves might be controlled or determined by still more fundamental principles. The paradox of control in a mechanistic, purposeless universe forms the philosophical core of Lovecraft's hierarchical ambiguity. His philosophical materialism held that consciousness emerged accidentally from matter organized in particular configurations, that the universe operated according to physical laws, admitting no purpose or teleology, and that entities like gods existed, if at all, as highly organized matter rather than transcendent spirits. This creates a logical problem. In mechanistic universe, governed by impersonal laws, what does control mean? Do the outer gods control cosmic processes, or do they simply represent particularly powerful configurations of matter operating according to the same deterministic principles governing everything else? If physical laws determine all outcomes, then those laws, not any conscious entity, constitute the real controller. Yet physical laws lack consciousness, intention, or agency, making them poor candidates for sovereignty in any traditional sense. Lovecraft's genius was recognizing that this philosophical problem could be transformed into horror. The search for cosmic authority might reveal either infinite regress of entities controlling entities, or the more disturbing revelation that nothing controls anything, that apparent cosmic order emerges from blind forces following mathematical necessities that themselves require no explanation or grounding. Evolution from earlier stories, treating local horrors, to later work constructing universal systems, demonstrates Lovecraft's increasing philosophical ambition. Stories from the early 1920s, like The Rats in the Walls or The Lurking Fear, featured ancient evils confined to specific locations, threatening protagonists through physical presence and psychological atmosphere rather than through cosmological implications. The shift toward cosmic architecture becomes evident in mid-period works where entities exist at global or cosmic scales, threatening not individual characters but entire species or planets. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Lovecraft wrote stories positioning individual humans as insignificant, that their encounters with cosmic forces barely registered. The entities operate at such scales that human consciousness cannot meaningfully interact with them except through fragmentary, sanity-destroying glimpses. This progression mirrors philosophy's move from local ethical questions to universal metaphysical speculation, from "how should I act?" to "why does anything exist?" The cosmic scope itself becomes source of horror. Not merely that powerful entities exist, but that power extends through so many hierarchical levels that humans cannot even locate themselves meaningfully within the structure. The question Lovecraft left deliberately unanswered, whether there is a top to infinity, haunts his work more effectively than any definitive cosmology could. His texts repeatedly gesture toward ultimate forces while simultaneously suggesting those forces might answer to still deeper principles. Is Azathoth truly supreme, or does it represent merely the deepest level human consciousness can approach before dissolution? Does Yog-Sothoth's omniscience extend to knowing what controls it? And if so, does that knowledge reveal controller or merely illuminate infinite regress? Lovecraft's refusal to provide answers reflects sophisticated understanding that cosmic horror requires permanent uncertainty. The moment we know definitively what sits atop the hierarchy, whether conscious God, blind force, or mathematical principle, that entity becomes comprehensible in ways that diminish its cosmic strangeness. By maintaining ambiguity, Lovecraft ensures his cosmology continues disturbing readers nearly a century later, because the question of cosmic control remains genuinely unresolved in both his fiction and in actual metaphysics. As we turn to examine the philosophical and religious traditions that prepared audiences for such questions, we must recognize that Lovecraft did not merely invent cosmic hierarchy problems, but rather translated ancient theological puzzles into modern cosmic horror vocabulary, giving new and more disturbing form to questions humans have asked since consciousness first contemplated its own cosmic position. Gnostic Christianity's concept of the pleroma provides perhaps the most direct historical precedent for Lovecraft's hierarchical cosmic structures extending beyond conventional divinity. 2nd and 3rd century Gnostic texts describe reality as emanating from an ultimate source through successive levels of divine beings called ions, each level less perfect than the one above, until reaching the flawed material world created by the demiurge. The pleroma itself represents totality of divine fullness existing beyond human comprehension, with the unknowable monad, or one, occupying position above all other entities. This creates theological hierarchy, where even powerful creator gods serve as intermediaries between ultimate reality and manifest existence. Lovecraft encountered these concepts through his extensive reading in comparative religion and philosophy, recognizing their potential for generating cosmic anxiety. The Gnostic system offered template for entities beyond entities, for cosmic structures extending past what human consciousness can meaningfully grasp, and for the disturbing possibility that what we perceive as supreme power represents merely low-level manifestation of deeper realities. Yet Lovecraft stripped away Gnostic framework's redemptive elements, where Gnosticism offered gnosis as escape route from material imprisonment. Lovecraft's cosmology provides no escape, because consciousness itself exists within the dream or determination it seeks to transcend. Neoplatonic emanation theory developed by Plotinus in the 3rd century and refined by later philosophers, articulated sophisticated model of hierarchical reality radiating from single source called the One. According to this framework, the One generates intellect through overflow of its perfection. Intellect generates soul. Soul generates material world, with each level possessing less unity and more multiplicity than its source. The system creates chain of being extending from absolute transcendent unity down through increasingly complex and imperfect manifestations. What makes this relevant to Lovecraft's cosmic horror is the One's characterization. It exists beyond being, beyond consciousness, beyond any predicate whatsoever, more accurately described by negation than affirmation. We cannot say the One is anything because being itself represents limitation. The One transcends. Lovecraft absorbed this philosophical tradition's insight that ultimate reality might be so fundamentally different from human categories that consciousness cannot grasp it, except through inadequate analogies. Where Neoplatonism maintained that emanation occurred through necessity of the One's perfection, Lovecraft replaced purposeful emanation with accidental dream or blind mechanical process, transforming philosophical hierarchy into horror hierarchy by removing every trace of intentionality or benevolence. Hindu cosmology presents elaborate hierarchies where Brahman exists above the gods, gods above mortals, with layers of reality nested within each other like cosmic Russian dolls. The Vedic and Puranic texts describe powerful deities like Indra, Vishnu, or Shiva operating within cosmos, yet even these gods remain manifestations of, or participants in Brahman, the ultimate reality that is simultaneously personal God and impersonal absolute. Some Hindu philosophical schools position Brahman as conscious source of all existence, while others treat it as impersonal principle beyond consciousness, as ground of being that transcends distinctions between conscious and unconscious. The concept of Maya, usually inadequately translated as illusion, suggests that hierarchies themselves might be provisional, that distinctions between levels of reality serve pragmatic purposes without capturing ultimate truth. Lovecraft drew on these ideas, particularly the notion that apparent cosmic structures might be Maya, obscuring something more fundamental and more alien. His entities function like corrupted versions of Hindu deities, possessing vast power but lacking benevolence, operating at cosmic scales but without the moral frameworks that make Hindu gods ultimately trustworthy. The question of what controls the outer gods parallels the question of whether Brahman controls manifestation or simply is manifestation. Kabbalistic Judaism's concept of Ein Sof, the infinite, unknowable aspect of God existing before and beyond creation, provided another model for ultimate reality, transcending comprehension. Kabbalistic texts describe how Ein Sof emanates reality through 10 sephirot, or divine attributes, creating structured cosmos from infinite, undifferentiated source. Yet Ein Sof itself remains utterly transcendent, beyond attributes, beyond names, beyond human conceptualization. The mystical texts emphasize that even calling Ein Sof God imposes limitation on what is limitless, that any positive statement about ultimate reality falsifies through the very attempt to predicate. This apophatic tradition, describing the divine through negation rather than affirmation, resonates with Lovecraft's approach to cosmic entities. Azathoth gets described as blind and idiot, Yog-Sothoth as existing beyond dimensional space, Nyarlathotep as crawling chaos. Each description tells us more about what the entity is not than what it is. The Kabbalistic insight that ultimate reality resists positive description becomes in Lovecraft's hands the horror that ultimate cosmic authority cannot be known because it operates according to principles consciousness cannot process. Where Kabbalah maintained that Ein Sof's incomprehensibility reflected divine transcendence, Lovecraft suggests it might reflect cosmic indifference, or the incompatibility between consciousness and the forces that accidentally generated consciousness. Schopenhauer's philosophy of will as fundamental reality beneath phenomenal appearances provided Lovecraft with crucial conceptual framework for unconscious cosmic force, exercising something like control without possessing consciousness or intention. In The World as Will and Representation, 1818, Schopenhauer argued that beneath the world of objects and causality lies blind, purposeless will, a striving, desiring force that generates all existence without knowing it does so, without having reasons for its manifestations, without caring about the suffering its operations produce. This will is not an entity among other entities, but rather the thing in itself, underlying all phenomenal reality. Schopenhauer's pessimism extended to recognizing that consciousness emerged from will only to discover itself trapped in existence it never chose, subject to forces it cannot control, because those forces precede consciousness and operate according to no rational principle. Lovecraft absorbed this vision of reality as manifestation of blind force, but cosmicized it, where Schopenhauer located will metaphysically within each being. Lovecraft externalized and multiplied it, creating pantheon of forces that might themselves be expressions of still more fundamental cosmic will. Azathoth functions as Schopenhauer's will made theological, supreme in sense of being ultimate source, yet mindless, purposeless, generating reality through blind operation rather than conscious design. Nietzsche's concepts of eternal recurrence and power without agency challenged traditional notions of cosmic control and divine sovereignty in ways that prefigured Lovecraft's cosmic horror. Nietzsche's famous declaration that God is dead pointed not just toward atheism, but toward something more disturbing, the recognition that Western civilization had organized itself around transcendent meaning source, now revealed as human projection. The question then became, what replaces God as cosmic authority once we recognize no conscious entity directs reality? Nietzsche's answer involved will to power operating through all existence, but will to power as description of how force operates rather than as conscious entity wielding force. This creates universe where power exists, where hierarchies form, where some forces dominate others, yet without ultimate authority, directing the process or assigning meaning to outcomes. Eternal recurrence, Nietzsche's thought experiment about reality repeating infinitely, generates existential vertigo, similar to contemplating infinite hierarchies of control. If everything recurs eternally, does the cycle have a controller, or does it simply operate? If cosmic process repeats without beginning or end, who or what maintains the repetition? Lovecraft transformed these philosophical problems into narrative horror by suggesting that cosmic structures might indeed operate eternally according to patterns that consciousness can glimpse but never control or escape. Einstein's conception of space-time and the block universe theory, emerging from relativity physics, challenged conventional notions of causality and control in ways that resonated with Lovecraft's cosmic vision. According to relativistic physics, time is not absolute flow, but rather dimension similar to space, with past, present, and future all equally real and existing simultaneously from perspective outside time. This block universe view suggests determinism without determiner. Events are fixed, not because something controls them, but because that is how space-time is structured. Causality becomes perspective dependent rather than absolute. From inside time, we perceive cause preceding effect, but from outside time, all events simply exist in their spatio-temporal relations without one causing another in conventional sense. Lovecraft incorporated these ideas through entities like Yog-Sothoth, existing outside time and perceiving all moments simultaneously. The question then becomes, does Yog-Sothoth control temporal reality by knowing all moments, or does it merely witness what already exists eternally? If all possible moments exist within block universe structure, who or what determined that structure? The physics suggested to Lovecraft that asking who controls might be category error. Reality might be constrained by its mathematical and physical structure without any conscious entity imposing those constraints, making control an illusory concept we project onto patterns that simply are. Thermodynamic determinism and the second law of thermodynamics provided final crucial element in Lovecraft's synthesis of scientific and philosophical ideas about cosmic control. The 19th century recognition that entropy increases in closed systems, that energy dissipates, that the universe tends toward heat death, introduced determinism at cosmic scale grounded in physical necessity rather than divine decree. Physical laws govern everything, and physical laws themselves require no explanation beyond mathematical description of how nature operates. This creates disturbing possibility that what seems like cosmic hierarchy of control, more powerful entities controlling less powerful ones, actually reflects merely more accurate alignment with underlying physical principles. The outer gods would then be controlled only in sense that they operate according to same physical laws governing everything else, but at scales and in configurations that make them vastly more powerful than terrestrial consciousness. The ultimate controller would be mathematics itself, equations describing how energy and matter must behave, with no conscious entity behind the equations imposing them. They simply describe what is. As we turn to examine the specific language Lovecraft used to encode these philosophical problems in his mythology, we must recognize that he synthesized centuries of theological and philosophical speculation about cosmic hierarchy into fictional framework that makes those abstract problems viscerally disturbing by suggesting that the answer to who controls the cosmos might be no one, nothing, or something so alien that the question itself reveals our incapacity to think outside anthropocentric categories. The terminological distinction Lovecraft maintained between outer gods, great old ones, and elder gods creates hierarchical structure through nomenclature itself, with each designation carrying specific implications about cosmic position and relationship to reality. The great old ones, like Cthulhu, occupy the lowest tier in this linguistic hierarchy. They are old in sense of being ancient relative to human civilization, great relative to terrestrial scale, but neither adjective suggests cosmic supremacy. These entities remain bound to physical locations, or Leia, various planets, suggesting spatial limitation incompatible with ultimate authority. The outer gods receive designation marking them as external to reality itself. Outer implies existing beyond dimensional boundaries, outside the spatial temporal framework containing everything else. This linguistic choice positions them as more fundamental than entities merely dwelling within cosmos, however powerful those entities might be. Yet even gods proves problematic term suggesting anthropocentric projection, entities with consciousness, intention, capacity to be worshipped or appeased. Lovecraft's letters reveal awareness that calling these entities gods imposed misleading framework, but he lacked better vocabulary for forces operating at scales where conventional categories collapse. The absence of a commonly used term for whatever might exist beyond outer gods becomes itself significant. Perhaps there is no term because there is no stable concept, or because consciousness cannot generate vocabulary for hierarchical levels it cannot conceptually access. The significance of outer as descriptor extends beyond mere spatial metaphor to suggest ontological exteriority, existence prior to or independent of manifest reality. Traditional cosmology positions gods within or above reality. Olympus sits atop mountains. Heaven exists beyond visible sky, but both occupy relational positions within cosmos. They govern. Outer suggests something more radical, existing outside the framework of existence itself, prior to the categories through which humans cognize reality. We might think of outer gods as occupying position analogous to noumenal realm in Kantian philosophy, the thing in itself existing independently of human perception but forever inaccessible to human knowledge, because knowledge operates through categories that apply only to phenomenal realm. Yet Lovecraft's usage suggests something more disturbing than mere inaccessibility. The outer gods are outer, not because they hide, but because they exist in modes incompatible with inside-outside distinctions, because spatial language fails when applied to entities preceding space itself. The term creates aporia. We say outer to indicate they exist beyond spatial categories, but outer as itself spatial term, revealing language's inadequacy for describing what it attempts to describe. This linguistic breakdown replicates at verbal level the cognitive breakdown characters experience when encountering entities that exceed consciousness's capacity to process. Control proves deeply problematic term when applied to entities beyond intention, yet Lovecraft had no satisfactory alternative for describing relationships between cosmic forces. English control derives from medieval Latin contrarotulus, referring to counter-roll or duplicate register used for verification. Control originally meant comparing accounts to ensure accuracy, suggesting conscious checking and oversight. The term carries implications of conscious intention, deliberate regulation, purposeful direction. Yet these implications seem precisely wrong for entities characterized by mindlessness, blind operation, mechanical necessity. Can Azathoth control anything when it possesses no consciousness to form intention to control? Does Yog-Sothoth control reality or merely constitute the framework within which reality operates? The linguistic problem reflects deeper conceptual problem. If ultimate cosmic forces operate deterministically, according to physical laws, does control apply at all, or does it represent anthropomorphic projection onto impersonal processes? Lovecraft's texts exploit this ambiguity, sometimes suggesting genuine cosmic hierarchy, where higher entities exercise power over lower ones, other times implying that apparent hierarchy merely reflects different scales of operation within single deterministic system. The instability of control as concept generates anxiety. We cannot know whether anything controls the outer gods because we cannot know whether control exists as cosmic reality or merely as human interpretive framework. Azathoth receives titles like Sultan and Lord that impose monarchical language on entity explicitly characterized as unconscious, creating productive contradiction between terminology and nature. Sultan derives from Arabic meaning power or authority, specifically political sovereignty exercised through conscious rule. The term suggests deliberate governance, intentional maintenance of order, awareness of subjects, and exercise of prerogative over them. Yet Lovecraft's texts insist Azathoth is blind idiot god, possessing no consciousness, no intentions, no awareness of its supposed dominion. The linguistic contradiction becomes thematic feature. Human languages evolved to describe human-scale phenomena inevitably distort when stretched to cosmic scales. We call Azathoth Sultan because we lack vocabulary for blind force occupying supreme position, ruler without ruling, sovereign without sovereignty, authority without authorship. The monarchical language also subverts itself through the text's descriptions of demon musicians maintaining Azathoth's sleep through continuous piping and drumming. What kind of sultan requires constant maintenance to prevent awakening? What kind of rule depends on external forces keeping the ruler unconscious? The language suggests power, while the content undermines power, leaving readers uncertain whether Azathoth genuinely controls or merely occupies central position within system that controls it through preventing its awakening. Nyarlathotep's designation as soul and messenger positions this entity as mediator between hierarchical levels, suggesting agency that serves forces beyond itself. Soul, in this context, proves difficult to interpret, not individual soul in Christian sense, but perhaps animating principle, the consciousness or intention through which unconscious forces achieve expression. Messenger more clearly indicates intermediary function, one who carries communications between parties, who mediates between sender and recipient, who possesses sufficient consciousness to comprehend messages while lacking authority to originate them. Nyarlathotep appears throughout Lovecraft's work as the active agent, the entity that walks among humans in various forms, deceives, manipulates, arranges circumstances. This suggests agency that other outer gods lack. Nyarlathotep can intend, can plan, can execute schemes requiring sequential thought. Yet messenger status indicates this agency serves something beyond itself, that Nyarlathotep's apparent autonomy actually represents heteronomy, action determined by forces it mediates rather than originates. This creates interesting philosophical problem. If Nyarlathotep possesses consciousness but exercises it only to serve unconscious masters, does it truly possess agency? Or does consciousness itself become mere mechanism through which blind forces achieve effects they cannot intend? The language suggests that gaining consciousness might not grant freedom from cosmic determination, but rather make one aware of one's own lack of freedom. Yog-Sothoth's characterization as the gate and the key suggests access rather than authority, knowledge rather than power, aperture rather than sovereign. This language positions the entity not as ruler but as threshold, not as controller but as passage through which one might reach whatever lies beyond. Gate implies boundary between domains, opening that allows traversal while remaining distinct from what it connects. Key suggests unlocking, enabling access to what was previously closed, but key itself neither owns nor controls what it opens. Together, the terms indicate Yog-Sothoth's function as cosmic nexus, the point through which all times and spaces connect, through which entities might pass between hierarchical levels. Yet the texts also describe Yog-Sothoth as omniscient, as coterminous with all space and time, as the all-in-one and one-in-all. This suggests something closer to pantheistic divinity than mere doorway. The linguistic ambiguity becomes thematic. Is Yog-Sothoth the access point to higher authorities, or is it itself the totality beyond which nothing exists? Does it unlock passage to ultimate cosmic controller, or does its omniscience reveal that no such controller exists? The gate-to-key language allows both interpretations, maintaining productive uncertainty about whether cosmic hierarchy extends beyond this entity, or whether Yog-Sothoth represents limit of hierarchy beyond which lies not higher authority, but only its own infinite, indifferent omniscience. The absence of a name for whatever might control the outer gods becomes itself significant aspect of Lovecraft's linguistic strategy, embodying through omission what cannot be embodied through nomination. Throughout his fiction and letters, Lovecraft names dozens of entities, places, tomes, each receiving specific designation, however unpronounceable. But no term exists for the hypothetical force or principle above the outer gods. This absence might indicate simply that Lovecraft never conceived such a force, or more intriguingly, that he recognized naming it would domesticate what should remain unnameable. To name ultimate controller would be to bring it within human conceptual space, to grant it existence within linguistic framework that consciousness can manipulate. The unnamed, and perhaps unnameable force beyond the outer gods remains more disturbing than any named entity could be, because it resists the most basic cognitive operation through which humans master their world, naming and thereby claiming conceptual access. Some things, Lovecraft's linguistic practice suggests, exceed language, not contingently, but necessarily, not because we haven't found right words yet, but because language itself operates at scale inadequate to cosmic ultimates. The silence, where a name should be, speaks more eloquently than any name could about limits of human thought, encountering what thought cannot think. Linguistic patterns across Lovecraft's work suggest infinite regress rather than ultimate source through recursive structures and perpetual deferral of final explanations. Characters learn of entities beyond what they knew, only to discover those entities answer to higher ones who might themselves serve deeper forces with no terminal point where the progression stops. This linguistic structure mirrors the philosophical problem. If every controller requires explanation, and explanation consists of citing higher controller, when does explanation end? Does it terminate in entity requiring no explanation, the unmoved mover? Or does it continue infinitely with each level raising same question about what controls the controllers? Lovecraft's language often employs formulations like forces beyond, entities past, realms outside, using prepositions that suggest spatial or hierarchical extension without specifying boundaries. The texts gesture toward, but never reach terminus, maintaining suggestion that however far one extends the hierarchy, further extensions remain possible or necessary. This creates cosmology that is architecturally open-ended, that cannot be closed into systematic totality, because closure would falsify. As we turn to examine how Lovecraft constructed narrative authenticity around these deliberately unstable linguistic and conceptual frameworks, we must recognize that his etymological choices and naming practices perform philosophical work. They do not merely label entities, but rather create linguistic field where every designation simultaneously reveals and conceals, where naming admits ignorance as much as it claims knowledge, and where the most significant cosmic principles might be those for which no names exist, and perhaps can exist. Lovecraft's construction of cosmic hierarchies through strategic omission represents sophisticated mythological technique, where unanswered questions generate more compelling mythology than definitive answers could. Unlike systematic fantasy world builders who meticulously chart every aspect of their invented cosmologies, Lovecraft deliberately left gaps, contradictions, and ambiguities that invite interpretation while resisting resolution. The question of what controls the outer gods appears in his work not as explicit inquiry, but as structural absence, as implication emerging from scattered references, suggesting forces beyond named entities without ever specifying those forces' nature. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Randolph Carter learns that Earth's gods serve the other gods, who themselves gather around Azathoth, but the text never confirms whether Azathoth represents absolute terminus or merely deepest level human consciousness can approach. Later stories mention ultimate chaos and forces beyond the rim without elaborating. This technique mirrors how actual mythologies develop, through accumulated traditions, fragmentary texts, conflicting accounts that collectively suggest complex realities no single source fully captures. By replicating mythology's fragmentary quality within fiction, Lovecraft creates entities that feel genuinely ancient, genuinely mysterious, genuinely resistant to complete comprehension. The power of unanswered questions in mythological systems exceeds the power of any specific answer because questions engage consciousness differently than assertions, requiring active cognitive participation rather than passive reception. When Lovecraft leaves ambiguous whether Azathoth rules or merely exists, whether Yog-Sothoth knows what controls it, whether Nyarlathotep serves specific master or simply serves as blind force's expression, readers must generate their own interpretations from insufficient evidence. This cognitive activity makes the mythology psychologically active rather than inert. It lives in readers' attempts to resolve ambiguity rather than dying in definitive resolution. Ancient mythologies persist partly because their fragmentary survival allows each generation to reinterpret according to contemporary concerns, to find new meanings in old texts, to debate what the myths really meant. Lovecraft achieved similar effect deliberately rather than accidentally, creating mythology designed to resist closure. The question, who controls the outer gods, functions like a koan in Zen Buddhism, not puzzle with correct answer, but rather question whose contemplation reveals something about limits of rational thought. The horror emerges not from learning the answer, but from recognizing that the question might be malformed, that consciousness cannot frame the problem adequately to admit solution. Cross-references, suggesting without confirming ultimate authority, create web of implications that readers assemble into cosmology, always exceeding textual evidence. In Through the Gates of the Silver Key, Yog-Sothoth appears as ultimate reality, the all-in-one and one-in-all, suggesting nothing exists beyond it. Yet other texts position Yog-Sothoth as one outer god among others, implying peers rather than supremacy. The Whisperer in Darkness mentions ultimate void beyond the outer god's courts. Letters reference nuclear chaos as fundamental reality. These scattered references cannot be reconciled into single consistent cosmology, yet together they suggest cosmic structures extending far beyond explicit description. Lovecraft's method resembles archaeological evidence. We possess fragments of larger whole, enough to know something vast existed, but insufficient to reconstruct it completely. Readers become archaeologists of cosmic horror, assembling partial evidence into provisional interpretations, always subject to revision as new textual fragments reveal themselves on rereading. The mythology thus maintains inexhaustibility. You cannot exhaust it through interpretation because interpretation cannot achieve closure with incomplete evidence, and evidence by design remains incomplete. The distinction between false gods of Earth and true cosmic entities establishes hierarchy while immediately problematizing truth claims about cosmic authority. Lovecraft's texts frequently reference how various human cultures worshipped what they thought were gods, but were merely great old ones, powerful entities, but not truly cosmic forces. This demotes terrestrial deities to middle management within vaster structure. Yet the texts then suggest outer gods might themselves be provisional, that what seems cosmically ultimate from limited perspective might prove merely local authority within still vaster context. This creates recursive skepticism. If we were wrong about terrestrial gods, how do we know we're right about outer gods? If cosmic hierarchy extends beyond what we can perceive, how would we distinguish genuine ultimate authority from merely the deepest level we've accessed so far? The question echoes Descartes' problem of the evil demon. How do we know our most certain beliefs aren't deceptions imposed by force we cannot detect? Lovecraft transforms epistemological philosophy into cosmic horror by suggesting we cannot know where hierarchy ends, cannot verify we've reached actual ultimate level, rather than merely another intermediate stage. Truth becomes relative to perspective, with no Archimedean point from which to determine absolute cosmic facts. Textual ambiguity regarding whether control exists or merely cosmic patterns operate deterministically runs throughout Lovecraft's mature work, creating fundamental uncertainty about cosmology's basic structure. Some passages suggest genuine hierarchy of power, entities commanding other entities, conscious or unconscious forces directing cosmic processes according to what resembles will or purpose. Other passages imply deterministic cosmos, where all entities, however powerful, simply follow physical laws and mathematical necessities, binding everything equally. Does Azathoth control the daemon musicians who maintain its sleep? Or do the musicians and Azathoth both operate within single deterministic system, with music causally necessary to maintain certain cosmic conditions rather than being commanded by conscious authority? Does Nyarlathotep choose to serve Azathoth, or does it simply function as mechanism through which blind chaos achieves effects requiring consciousness to implement? Lovecraft's philosophical materialism suggested the second interpretation, universe operating mechanically without purpose, but his narrative language often employs the first framework because human language evolved for describing intentional agents. The resulting ambiguity makes his cosmology simultaneously mechanistic and hierarchical, deterministic and purposive, creating cognitive dissonance that generates horror through irresolvable tension between incompatible frameworks. Later, authors' attempts to solve the hierarchy problem demonstrate risks of excessive systematization and rewards of maintaining productive ambiguity. August Derleth most notoriously imposed clear structure, positioning elder gods as benevolent cosmic order opposed to chaotic outer gods, creating good versus evil framework utterly foreign to Lovecraft's vision. This domesticated cosmic horror into conventional conflict between comprehensible moral forces, eliminating precisely the disturbing ambiguity about cosmic authority that made Lovecraft's mythology philosophically significant. Other authors took different approaches. Lynn Carter and Brian Lumley added entities above outer gods, creating still higher hierarchical levels, but merely extending the same structural problem upward rather than resolving it. Some modern writers wisely avoid definitiveness, treating the control question as permanently open inquiry rather than puzzle requiring solution. Role-playing games face particular challenge. Gameplay requires mechanical clarity about relative power levels and cosmic structures, yet too much definition destroys horror's effectiveness. The most successful treatments recognize that solving who controls the outer gods would constitute failure rather than achievement, that the mythology functions most powerfully when maintaining question as central mystery rather than moving toward answer. Why definitive answers destroy cosmic horror's effectiveness reveals something fundamental about how this genre operates psychologically and philosophically. Horror traditionally generates fear through threat. Monsters endanger characters. Readers identify with characters. Fear response engages. Cosmic horror operates differently, generating dread through implication rather than threat, through suggesting realities that undermine framework for making sense of existence. The moment we know definitively what controls the cosmos, whether conscious God, unconscious force, or nothing at all, that knowledge becomes manageable through familiar cognitive operations. We can categorize it, analyze it, position ourselves in relation to it. The power of cosmic horror lies precisely in attacking these cognitive operations, in suggesting realities that exceed or precede the categories through which consciousness organizes experience. Answering who controls the outer gods would grant closure, stability, comprehension, exactly what cosmic horror must deny to maintain its disturbing psychological effects. The unanswered question keeps consciousness unsettled, unable to achieve stable interpretation, forced to contemplate possibilities that remain possible, precisely because none becomes actual through textual confirmation. The reader, as investigator, assembling impossible cosmology from fragmentary evidence, becomes complicit in creating the horror they experience, making cosmic horror participatory rather than passively received. Lovecraft provides scattered clues, entities mentioned in one story, cryptic references in another, suggestive footnotes in letters, that readers must compile into working interpretation of cosmic structure. Yet the clues never suffice for definitive interpretation, leaving gaps that readers fill through speculation. This means each reader constructs slightly different cosmology from same textual evidence, each version emphasizing different implications, resolving ambiguities differently, privileging some references over others. The horror becomes personalized while maintaining connection to Lovecraft's actual texts. Moreover, the investigative process replicates the experience of his fictional characters, researching forbidden knowledge. Both reader and character assemble fragmentary hints into terrible comprehensive vision. Both discover that achieving comprehension brings no comfort, because what they comprehend is their own cosmic insignificance or reality's fundamental instability. The reader investigating who controls the outer gods through Lovecraft's texts mirrors the mad scholar investigating through forbidden tomes, and both discoveries, that the question has no safe answer or perhaps no coherent meaning, generate same existential vertigo. As we transition to examining the philosophical concepts embodied in Lovecraft's ambiguous cosmic hierarchies, we must recognize that his myth-building technique operates through denial as much as affirmation, through questions as much as answers, through gaps as much as connections, creating cosmology that remains permanently under construction precisely because no foundation proves stable enough to support completed edifice. The paradox of cosmic control centers on whether unconscious forces can meaningfully control anything when control implies intention, awareness, and purposeful direction. Traditional metaphysics distinguishes between efficient causation, one thing causing another mechanically, and final causation, where outcomes occur because conscious agent intends them. Azathoth might efficiently cause reality through its dreaming, but without consciousness, it cannot intend or direct what it causes. This creates a logical puzzle. If the supreme cosmic force lacks awareness, does supremacy mean anything? Power typically means capacity to affect intended outcomes, but intention requires consciousness. Azathoth lacks. The paradox intensifies when we consider that Azathoth's sleep must be maintained by demon musicians. If the supreme being requires maintenance by lesser beings, how is it supreme? The situation resembles inverted theology, where God depends on angels to sustain his existence rather than vice versa. Lovecraft forces readers to confront possibility that cosmic control might be category error, term applicable only at scales where consciousness exists. Determinism without determiner describes universe governed by laws admitting no exceptions, yet requiring no conscious lawgiver. Classical physics revealed nature operating according to mathematical regularities. Objects fall according to gravitational equations. Energy transforms according to thermodynamic principles. Motion follows Newtonian mechanics. These regularities function deterministically. Given initial conditions, outcomes follow necessarily. Yet the laws themselves possess no consciousness, intend nothing, exist simply as descriptions of how matter and energy behave. This creates a universe where everything is determined, yet nothing determines. Lovecraft's cosmology can be read as mythological expression of this scientific worldview. The outer gods represent fundamental physical principles given narrative form, forces that govern without governing in intentional sense. Azathoth becomes nuclear chaos underlying reality. Yog-Sothoth becomes space-time structure itself. Nyarlathotep becomes entropy or change made manifest. Under this interpretation, asking who controls the outer gods is like asking who controls gravity. The question mistakes description for entity, pattern for agent, hierarchy as human projection onto indifferent cosmos, suggests that apparent cosmic order reflects consciousness's pattern-finding tendency rather than actual cosmic structure. Human cognition evolved to detect patterns, identify hierarchies, impose order on experience. These cognitive operations enhance survival by allowing prediction and planning. Yet these same operations might generate illusory hierarchies when applied to cosmos operating without any hierarchical organization. We perceive outer gods as controlling lesser entities because we interpret power differentials through hierarchical frameworks. But power differentials might simply reflect different configurations of matter energy within single deterministic system. The hierarchy exists in our interpretation rather than in reality. This reading makes cosmic horror deeply epistemological. The horror lies not in discovering malevolent cosmic hierarchy, but in discovering that consciousness cannot help imposing hierarchical interpretations, even when aware those interpretations might be projections. We are trapped in our own pattern finding, unable to perceive cosmos without organizing it according to categories that might systematically falsify reality's actual structure. The horror of discovering control is illusion versus horror. That control exists but doesn't care creates dual possibilities equally disturbing. First possibility: no conscious entity controls anything. Apparent cosmic order emerges from blind mechanical processes following mathematical necessities. Hierarchy proves entirely human projection. Ultimate reality contains no authority, sovereignty, or governance whatsoever. This negates every theological and political framework humans developed. If cosmos lacks control, structure, human meanings and values become truly arbitrary, groundless, sustained only by mutual agreement within species possessing no cosmic significance. Second possibility: genuine control exists at cosmic level, but controller operates according to purposes so alien that from human perspective, control might as well not exist. The controller cares nothing for human welfare, meaning, or survival. We exist within governed cosmos, but governance serves ends incomprehensible and possibly inimical to everything consciousness values. Both possibilities generate existential dread, but through different mechanisms. First dissolves meaning by removing any grounding. Second acknowledges grounding, but makes it actively hostile or radically indifferent. Lovecraft's genius lies in maintaining ambiguity between these equally disturbing options. Emergent order from chaos raises question of whether pattern implies intention or merely reflects how complexity inevitably organizes given sufficient scale. Chaos theory and complexity science demonstrate how ordered structures emerge spontaneously from chaotic systems without requiring external designer or controller. Weather patterns, crystal formations, evolutionary processes all exhibit order arising from interaction of simple rules without conscious direction. If outer gods represent fundamental forces, their control might simply be how reality organizes at cosmic scales given underlying physical laws. Azathoth's court might not be hierarchy of command, but rather stable configuration of forces maintaining certain conditions, like solar system maintaining planetary orbits through gravitational interactions. The daemon musicians piping around Azathoth then become not servants, but rather complementary forces that happen to sustain particular cosmic state. This interpretation removes agency from cosmic structure while maintaining appearance of organization. No one controls because control requires controller, yet patterns emerge that consciousness interprets as if controlled. The horror becomes recognizing that mind cannot stop interpreting patterns as intentional, even after knowing intention doesn't exist, that consciousness remains trapped in anthropomorphic thinking despite intellectual recognition of its inadequacy. Control as relationship versus control as property distinguishes between control existing through connections between entities versus control as attribute entities possess independently. Traditional theology treats divine sovereignty as God's property. He controls because he is omnipotent, because control inheres in his nature. Alternative framework sees control as relational. A controls B, not through A's intrinsic properties, but through specific relationship configuration. Under relational model, outer gods might not possess control, but rather participate in control relationships with other cosmic forces. Azathoth doesn't control through supreme power, but occupies position within network of forces where its state affects everything else. Disturbing its state, awakening it, would destabilize entire network. This resembles ecological systems where removing keystone species collapses ecosystem, not because species controlled ecosystem, but because ecosystem structure depended on that species' participation. The relational reading suggests asking who controls the outer gods misconstrues cosmic structure. Know who controls anything, but rather cosmic forces exist in mutual dependencies where each limits and enables others without hierarchy of ultimate authority. The question of whether outer gods are controlled or simply exist within constraints points toward limits of both language and metaphysics when addressing ultimate realities. Everything that exists operates within constraints. Physical laws, logical necessities, mathematical truths all constrain possible states and transformations. But constraints differ from control. Gravity constrains how objects move, but doesn't control movement in sense requiring conscious constraint, imposer. Similarly, outer gods might be constrained by logical necessities. Even Azathoth cannot make contradictions true. By mathematical structures, even Yog-Sothoth operates within topological and geometric principles. By physical laws at scales we cannot perceive. Yet these constraints don't constitute control by higher authority, but rather describe boundaries of possible existence. The question, who controls the outer gods, might then receive answer. Nothing and no one controls them, but neither are they unconstrained. They exist within framework of logical and physical possibility that itself requires no controller because it simply describes what can be. The horror lies in recognizing this framework offers no security, no purpose, no meaning. It simply is, and we exist within it entirely contingently, our existence depending on cosmic forces operating within constraints that neither care about us nor needed to produce us. As we examine specific entities and forces involved in these problematic control relationships, we must recognize that Lovecraft's cosmology operates at intersection of philosophy, physics, and psychology, where questions about cosmic authority become questions about consciousness's capacity to think beyond its own limitations. Azathoth's characterization as mindless ruler creates fundamental contradiction that subverts every traditional conception of sovereignty and cosmic authority. The entity receives titles like Sultan and Lord of all things, while simultaneously being described as blind idiot God, possessing no consciousness, intention, or awareness. This paradox cannot be resolved through conventional categories. A ruler must know it rules, must possess awareness of subjects and capacity to exercise judgment over them. Yet Lovecraft insists Azathoth lacks these requisites, existing in state of unconscious chaos at reality's center. The contradiction forces recognition that traditional political and theological metaphors fail when extended to cosmic scales. Perhaps Azathoth rules, only in sense that everything depends on its continued sleep, that disturbing it would end existence, making its state supremely important without making it supreme in sense of possessing authority. Or perhaps ruler represents desperate human attempt to impose familiar frameworks on entity that should receive no familiar designation. Yog-Sothoth presents different philosophical puzzle as omniscient entity that apparently knows everything, yet either cannot or does not act on that knowledge to alter cosmic conditions. Lovecraft describes Yog-Sothoth as the key and the gate, as coterminous with all space and time, as knowing all things across past, present, and future. This suggests consciousness. To know requires something that knows, yet whether Yog-Sothoth possesses subjectivity remains ambiguous. If it knows all, it must know what controls it, if anything does. If it knows what controls it, yet cannot or will not act on that knowledge, it lacks freedom despite omniscience. If nothing controls it, yet it still does not act freely to alter cosmic conditions according to will, then omniscience grants no power. Traditional theology treated divine omniscience as aspect of divine sovereignty. God knows all because he controls all, his knowledge and power operating together. Lovecraft divorces knowledge from control, suggesting vast consciousness, observing everything, yet changing nothing, aware of all cosmic processes, yet participating in them only as necessary component rather than directing authority. Nyarlathotep occupies unique position as entity possessing agency without autonomy, acting purposefully while serving forces that possess no purposes. Throughout Lovecraft's fiction, Nyarlathotep appears as active agent, deceiving, manipulating, orchestrating events according to what seems like plans requiring sequential reasoning. This distinguishes it from Azathoth's unconsciousness and Yog-Sothoth's passive omniscience. Yet Nyarlathotep receives designation as soul and messenger of the outer gods, suggesting its agency serves something beyond itself. Messenger implies one who delivers communications from sender to recipient, requiring consciousness to understand messages while lacking authority to originate them. If Nyarlathotep serves as Azathoth's messenger, what messages can unconscious entities send? Perhaps consciousness emerges as epiphenomenon of unconscious chaos, intention arising from forces that possess no intentions, purpose generated as byproduct of purposeless processes. Nyarlathotep then represents moment, when blind cosmic forces accidentally achieve consciousness while remaining determined by the unconscious forces generating them. This creates agency without freedom, intention without ultimate authorship. Nyarlathotep thinks it acts freely, but merely executes operations determined by deeper forces it cannot escape or alter. Shub-Niggurath embodies fecundity without purpose, creation without direction, generating endless life forms that serve no cosmic plan. Known in Lovecraft's texts as the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, this entity represents fertility and reproduction raised to cosmic scale. Yet this productivity operates blindly. Shub-Niggurath does not create toward any end, does not design offspring to serve purposes, simply generates variations endlessly without teleology. This mirrors biological evolution as Darwin described it, variation and selection, producing complexity and apparent design without actual designer or purpose. If Shub-Niggurath creates without intention, and if it serves larger cosmic forces, those forces must also operate without intention, because intentional creators would channel creativity toward purposes rather than allowing blind proliferation. The entity thus supports interpretation that outer gods represent mechanistic processes made mythological rather than conscious beings exercising control. Creation occurs not because someone creates, but because generative processes operate according to their nature. The unnamed forces beyond the outer gods appear in fragmentary references throughout Lovecraft's work without receiving definite characterization or description. Through the Gates of the Silver Key mentions archetypes existing at deeper level than individual outer gods. The Whisperer in Darkness references ultimate void and spaces beyond. Letters discuss nuclear chaos beyond angled space in ways suggesting something more fundamental than even Azathoth. These hints never cohere into systematic description, yet collectively suggest cosmic structures extending past named entities. Whether these forces beyond possess consciousness, whether they control outer gods, or simply constitute framework within which outer gods operate, remains utterly unclear. The vagueness proves essential. Definite description would domesticate what should remain alien. These hints function like asymptotic limit in mathematics. Named entities approach, but never reach ultimate reality, with each level suggesting further levels without ever reaching bedrock, requiring no further explanation. The unnamed forces thus serve mythological function not through what they are, but through gesture toward what exceeds articulation. Physical laws, entropy, and mathematical structures might constitute the real controllers in Lovecraft's cosmos if we interpret mythology as metaphorical expression of scientific principles. Second law of thermodynamics states, entropy increases in closed systems, energy dissipates, complexity tends toward dissolution, universe progresses toward heat death. These physical necessities govern everything without requiring conscious enforcer. They simply describe how reality operates. If outer gods represent mythological personifications of fundamental forces, then what controls them is mathematical and physical necessity itself. Azathoth's chaos represents maximum entropy. Yog-Sothoth represents space-time structure. Nyarlathotep represents change and transformation. Shub-Niggurath represents matter's capacity for self-organization. Under this reading, asking what controls these entities is like asking what controls equations. They aren't controlled because they don't possess agency requiring control. They simply are descriptions of how existence must operate given its fundamental structure. The horror then becomes recognizing that ultimate cosmic authority consists of blind mathematical truths, admitting no exceptions, yet possessing no consciousness, no care, no purpose beyond describing what must be. The role of servitor races and demon musicians raises questions about whether they control or merely maintain cosmic conditions through their continuous activity. Lovecraft describes flute players surrounding Azathoth, piping ceaselessly to maintain its sleep. Do these entities possess agency, choosing to play? Were they created or commanded to play? And if so, by whom? Or do they simply represent forces that happen to maintain current cosmic state, operating mechanically without choice? If they chose to stop, would Azathoth awaken? Or is their piping itself determined by same forces determining everything else? The servitor races appear throughout Lovecraft's work, serving various entities, yet their nature remains unclear. Slaves, automatons, or necessary components of cosmic machinery. If outer gods require servitors to maintain their states, then servitors exercise control over entities supposedly supreme. Yet if servitors act without choice, mechanically performing functions built into cosmic structure, then neither servitors nor outer gods control anything. Both participate in self-sustaining system where nothing governs, yet patterns persist. This recursive uncertainty about agency at every hierarchical level prevents resolution into clear control structure, maintaining cosmic horror's essential ambiguity about whether anyone controls anything or whether control proves illusory concept consciousness projects onto mechanistic reality. If gods lack control over their own existence or purpose, the implications for human agency become devastating in ways that exceed traditional deterministic philosophies. Ordinary determinism argues that human choices result from prior causes, genetics, environment, neurological processes, making free will illusory while leaving practical agency intact. You might be determined to choose coffee over tea, but the choice still reflects your preferences and leads to predictable outcomes. Lovecraft's cosmic horror suggests something worse. If entities vastly more powerful than humans exist without genuine agency, merely playing out roles within system, none of them controls or even comprehends, then human agency becomes not just illusory, but cosmically insignificant, even as illusion. We are not just determined, but determined by forces that are themselves determined by forces that might extend infinitely without ever reaching conscious determiner. The horror lies not in lacking free will, but in discovering that nothing possesses it, that agency proves impossible at every scale, that purposeful action represents cognitive error rather than achievable ideal. Cultists serving entities that cannot reciprocate their devotion embody the absurdity of seeking relationship with forces incapable of awareness or care. Throughout Lovecraft's fiction, we deep encounter humans worshipping outer gods, performing elaborate rituals, supposedly pleasing to these entities, seeking favor or power through devotion. Yet if Azathoth possesses no consciousness, what can worship mean to it? If Nyarlathotep merely executes operations determined by blind chaos, can it grant boons or recognize faithful service? The cultist's error consists not simply in worshipping evil gods rather than good ones, but in presuming gods possess attributes like awareness, intention, and capacity for reciprocal relationship, when these entities exist at scales or in modes where such attributes prove categorically impossible. The worship becomes tragic farce, consciousness attempting communication with forces that cannot receive communication, offering devotion to entities constitutionally incapable of recognizing devotion exists. Yet the cultists sometimes achieve effects through their rituals, suggesting perhaps they accidentally align themselves with cosmic forces rather than actually influencing them, like someone claiming to control sunrise because they perform dawn ritual daily. The horror of discovering your masters have masters extends infinitely upward, creating vertigo of infinite regress where authority proves perpetually deferred. Imagine cultist who learns through terrible revelation that Cthulhu, the entity he served, itself serves the outer gods. This might initially seem like discovering organizational structure, CEO reports to board of directors, but with added discovery that board members possess no consciousness or purposes, making the hierarchy ultimately meaningless. Yet suppose further discovery reveals outer gods themselves answer to deeper forces, which might answer to still deeper principles recursively without terminal point where ultimate authority resides. Each revelation that seemed to reach cosmos's edge merely exposes another level requiring explanation. Traditional theology resolves this through unmoved mover, necessary being, God, who requires no further explanation. Lovecraft's cosmos offers no such resolution. Either hierarchy extends infinitely, making ultimate authority perpetually inaccessible, or it terminates in unconscious force like Azathoth, making sovereignty itself incoherent. Both options generate existential dread by removing any stable foundation for meaning or purpose. Attempting to manipulate entities that are themselves manipulated by forces beyond their control introduces layers of futility that transform magical practice into cosmic joke. Occult traditions typically assume that knowing true names, performing correct rituals, and understanding cosmic hierarchies grants power to compel or negotiate with supernatural entities. Lovecraft's cosmos systematically undermines these assumptions. If you learn ritual supposedly commanding outer God, but that entity operates mechanically without volition, the ritual cannot compel what lacks will to resist. If you attempt bargaining with Nyarlathotep, offering sacrifice for knowledge or power, but Nyarlathotep simply executes operations determined by forces beyond its control, the bargain becomes meaningless. It will do what it will do regardless of offerings. The magical practitioner imagines gaining leverage within cosmic hierarchy, but hierarchy itself proves illusory or extends beyond any point where human action could influence outcomes. Magic becomes not violation of natural law through supernatural means, but rather desperate attempt to impose intentionality onto processes that operate without intention to create personal relationship with forces incapable of personhood. Madness, as recognition that control extends infinitely upward or doesn't exist at all, transforms insanity from pathology into epistemological enlightenment that consciousness cannot survive. Lovecraft's characters frequently go mad upon learning cosmic truths, and typically readers interpret this as psyche breaking under weight of terrible knowledge. Yet we might read madness differently, as consciousness recognizing its own structural inability to function given what it has learned. If you discover that agency is impossible at every scale, that purposes cannot exist because nothing possesses genuine capacity to pursue purposes, that meaning-making represents elaborate self-deception consciousness performs to avoid recognizing its own purposelessness, how do you continue making choices? Choice requires presuming alternatives matter, that choosing one over another makes difference, that you possess some minimal capacity to determine outcomes through decisions. Learning that control doesn't exist or extends so far beyond human scale that human decisions cannot possibly matter removes psychological framework necessary for choice while leaving consciousness trapped in situation requiring constant choices. Madness represents not failure to cope, but accurate perception of irreconcilable contradiction between what consciousness must presume to function and what reality actually permits. Forbidden rituals raise question of whether they compel gods or merely align practitioners with existing patterns they would follow regardless of human action. When Lovecraft's characters perform rituals from forbidden grimoires, events subsequently occur, entities manifest, dimensions open, terrible knowledge becomes accessible. But causation remains ambiguous. Did ritual cause effects, or did ritual merely occur at moment when cosmic conditions happen to produce effects anyway? Consider astronomical alignment supposedly necessary for Cthulhu's return. Human ritual cannot alter planetary positions, so at most, ritual prepares humans to participate in or witness events that cosmic mechanics determines. The ritual practitioners believe they exercise power, but perhaps they merely successfully predict what will occur and position themselves to experience it. This reading makes all magical practice not communion with cosmic powers, but rather elaborate cargo cult behavior, performing actions correlated with desired outcomes while misunderstanding actual causal structure producing those outcomes. The practitioners might still achieve their goals, gaining forbidden knowledge, witnessing entity manifestations, but not through mechanism they imagine, making their success based on happy accident rather than genuine understanding or control. The ultimate cosmic joke consists of seeking power in universe where power proves meaningless because nothing, not even gods, genuinely possesses it. Power traditionally means capacity to affect intended outcomes, to impose will on reality, to determine conditions according to purposes. But if outer gods lack consciousness and intention, they possess no will to impose. If they operate mechanistically within determined system, they cannot alter outcomes from what must occur. If they answer to forces beyond themselves, extending infinitely or terminating in blind necessity, then power becomes incoherent concept. The human seeking power through cosmic knowledge or ritual alignment pursues something that doesn't exist, like alchemist seeking philosopher's stone or perpetual motion machine, not merely difficult to achieve, but categorically impossible given reality's actual structure. Yet consciousness cannot help seeking power, because seeking represents fundamental mode through which consciousness engages world. We are trapped, pursuing what cannot exist, because ceasing to pursue would require ceasing to function as conscious agents. The cosmic joke isn't that we fail to achieve power, but that we cannot stop trying, despite knowing power represents category error when applied to cosmos, where blind forces simply operate according to their nature, without anyone or anything exercising control over operations. The knowledge that destroys consists not of learning terrible facts, but of discovering that fundamental categories through which we organize reality prove inapplicable at cosmic scales. Traditional forbidden knowledge, how to summon demons, create weapons, manipulate psychology, remains dangerous because of what can be done with it. But the knowledge itself stays coherent within existing frameworks. Learning that no one controls the cosmos, or that control extends infinitely without terminus, or that apparent hierarchy masks mechanistic determinism, attacks the frameworks themselves. We cannot simply add this information to our existing understanding. We must rebuild understanding from foundations, but consciousness evolved within frameworks now revealed as inadequate. The destruction occurs because we cannot think without categories like agency, purpose, and causation. Yet these categories systematically misrepresent cosmic reality. We face choice between maintaining useful illusions that allow functioning or accepting truths that make functioning impossible. Neither option preserves consciousness intact. Illusions eventually shatter through accumulated evidence, while truths paralyze through removing grounds for action. Worse than nihilism, discovering hierarchy without purpose means recognizing that reality possesses structure elaborate enough to appear designed while containing no actual design or designer. Nihilism claims existence lacks inherent meaning, which disturbs but remains intellectually manageable. we acknowledge absence of cosmic purpose and either despair or create provisional human meanings sufficient for finite lives. But suppose you discover vast hierarchical structures extending across cosmic scales, entities of staggering power arranged in apparent order, forces operating with precision suggesting conscious regulation. Yet at every level, consciousness proves absent, purpose non-existent, the elaborate structure emerging mechanically from blind processes. This combines nihilism's meaninglessness with theism's structural complexity, creating horror greater than either alone could achieve. The structure seems to promise meaning through its very elaborateness. Surely such complex hierarchy serves some purpose. Yet investigation reveals only mechanism all the way down, patterns without patterns, maker, order without orderer. You cannot take comfort in simple meaninglessness because the cosmos exhibits too much apparent organization. You cannot find meaning in organization because organization operates purposelessly. The Necronomicon and other forbidden tomes contain hints about forces beyond forces that suggest epistemological infinities consciousness cannot process without dissolution. When Lovecraft's characters consult these grimoires, they encounter not merely descriptions of entities, but references to deeper principles underlying those entities, which themselves rest on still deeper foundations, recursively. The texts describe outer gods, then mention forces those gods serve or emerge from, then hint at principles underlying those forces, each level requiring previous level's comprehension while exceeding it. This creates impossible cognitive demand. To understand level N requires understanding level N1, but level N1 makes sense only in terms of level N2, extending indefinitely. Consciousness cannot complete this infinite regress, cannot achieve stable understanding. When understanding requires grasping what cannot be grasped because it recedes infinitely. The grimoires don't withhold final knowledge through authorial malice or incompleteness. They accurately represent structure that possesses no final level to know. Reading them generates vertigo, not from their horror, but from their accuracy in depicting reality's actual infinite recession away from any graspable foundation. Why knowing the controller's identity provides no comfort, even if answer could be definitively known, reveals how cosmic horror differs from conventional mystery. Detective stories create suspense through withholding information, then provide satisfaction through revelation. Learning who committed murder resolves narrative and emotional tensions. But suppose we learn definitively that blind mathematical necessity controls outer gods, which control lesser entities extending to humans. This knowledge resolves mystery, but intensifies horror. Now we know with certainty that nothing conscious governs cosmos, that hierarchy we inhabit operates mechanically, that our purposes and meanings exist within system constitutionally incapable of caring about or even registering such things. Or suppose we learned that conscious entity infinitely more powerful than outer gods exercises ultimate control. This merely raises question of what controls that entity, plus adds disturbing certainty that vast consciousness, aware of our existence, chooses not to intervene in our suffering or acknowledge our significance. Either answer, mechanistic or conscious controller, provides knowledge without consolation, certainty without comfort, resolution that resolves nothing about existential situation. Recursive horror escalates because the controller is controlled infinitely, eliminating possibility of ultimate authority or final grounding. Each discovery of higher controlling force initially seems like approaching ultimate explanation, but then reveals that force itself requires explanation through reference to still higher level. Traditional theology terminated this recursion through necessary being, entity whose existence requires no external cause because existence belongs to its essence. Lovecraft's cosmos offers no such terminus. Either recursion continues infinitely, making ultimate explanation perpetually inaccessible, or it terminates in unconscious force, like Azathoth, which explains hierarchy by removing explanatory framework altogether. Infinite regress means we can never understand why things are as they are, because understanding requires reaching level that itself needs no explanation. Termination in blind force means apparent explanation simply restates the problem at deeper level. We sought to understand why cosmos operates as it does, and learn it operates that way, because fundamental reality is chaos, which explains nothing while foreclosing further inquiry. Consciousness gets trapped between these equally unsatisfying options, unable to achieve stable understanding that would allow ceasing to question. Or worse, apparent control proves pattern recognition error, consciousness imposing hierarchical interpretations onto processes that simply happen without any control structure. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that asking who controls reveals not cosmic truth, but cognitive limitation. We cannot help organizing reality hierarchically, cannot help interpreting power differentials as authority structures, cannot help presuming intentionality behind patterns. Yet these interpretive operations systematically falsify. The outer gods might not control lesser entities. They might simply represent different scales or modes of mechanical operation within single deterministic system where nothing controls anything. What we interpret as cosmic hierarchy might be consciousness's desperate attempt to impose familiar frameworks on reality that operates according to principles consciousness cannot natively grasp. This means every answer to who controls the outer gods misses the point by presuming control exists to be explained. The real horror becomes recognizing we cannot stop asking control questions even after understanding that control represents projection rather than cosmic feature, that we remain trapped in anthropomorphic thinking despite intellectual recognition of its inadequacy. The mad scholar's revelation that asking who controls presumes control exists transforms the question from cosmic mystery into epistemological error. Throughout Lovecraft's fiction, characters research forbidden knowledge, seeking answers to cosmological questions, eventually going mad or dying from their discoveries. We typically read this as consciousness breaking under weight of terrible truths learned, but perhaps madness represents moment when character recognizes the question itself was malformed, that consciousness's fundamental operating assumptions prove false, that the categories through which we organize experience, agency, causation, purpose, control, simply don't map onto reality at scales where they seem most important. The scholar asking who controls the outer gods eventually realizes this is like asking what color is Tuesday, or how much does justice weigh? A question that seems grammatically correct but commits category error by applying concepts to domains where they cannot apply. Yet recognizing this provides no relief, because consciousness cannot stop operating through these categories, cannot think without presuming agency and causation even after knowing presumption is false. The madness consists not in learning terrible answers, but in discovering questions themselves are meaningless while remaining unable to stop asking them. As we transition to examining specific literary texts where Lovecraft encoded these philosophical problems, we must recognize that his cosmic horror operates at intersection of metaphysics and psychology, where questions about ultimate reality become questions about consciousness's capacity to think truthfully about conditions of its own existence. References to higher entities appear fragmentarily in Lovecraft's early 1920s work, suggesting hierarchical structures extending beyond explicitly named entities without providing systematic cosmology. In The Festival, 923, the narrator encounters blasphemous references to things that brooded and lurked and fed and snapped and scratched, in texts describing forces beyond ordinary comprehension. While this story focuses primarily on immediate horror, it establishes precedent for suggesting deeper cosmic layers through fragmentary hints. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, mentions that great old ones came from the stars and served purposes humans cannot fathom, implying they answer to or emerge from forces not directly described. These early hints operate through strategic vagueness. Lovecraft gestures toward cosmic structures without mapping them completely, allowing readers to intuit vastness without receiving definitive exposition. The technique establishes pattern he would refine throughout the 1920s and 1930s, building mythology through scattered references, accumulating suggestiveness rather than through comprehensive cosmological treatises. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1926-1927, provides most extensive early treatment of cosmic hierarchy, with Randolph Carter learning that gods themselves serve higher powers. Carter seeks the gods of Earth's dreamlands to ask about his Sunset City, but his quest leads through successive revelations about power's true locus. He discovers first that Earth's gods dwell atop unknown Kadath, then that these gods serve the other gods who dwell in outer darkness, and finally, that even other gods gather around Azathoth at Chaos's center. The narrative structure mirrors epistemological progression. Each answer reveals deeper question. Each destination becomes waypoint toward further destination. Each apparent authority proves subject to higher one. Lovecraft writes that Carter approached the throne of chaos where the thin flutes pipe mindlessly and where the demon sultan Azathoth gnaws hungrily. Yet even this apparent terminus contains ambiguity. Does Azathoth rule, or merely occupy central position? The text never clarifies whether gods serve Azathoth through conscious submission or simply exist within cosmic structure he represents. The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, introduces cosmic hierarchies through alien perspective, with Mygo discussing entities and forces they reference without explaining fully. The protagonist discovers recordings of alien conversations mentioning Yoggoth and beyond, the ultimate void, and forces at the rim. These phrases suggest spatial extension of cosmic hierarchy, planes beyond planets, voids beyond space, forces at reality's edge. The aliens treat these references casually, as established facts within their cosmology rather than revelations requiring explanation, which enhances authenticity while maintaining mystery. We learn enough to know vast structures exist, extending beyond human comprehension, but never enough to map those structures definitively. The fragmentary nature of information mimics how actual encounters with superior knowledge might function. We overhear portions of conversations operating at conceptual levels we cannot fully access, catching glimpses of frameworks that exceed our interpretive capacity. The story suggests that even highly advanced species like mygo occupy middle positions within hierarchies, extending both above and below them. Scattered mentions of forces beyond named entities appear throughout Lovecraft's mature work without coalescing into systematic doctrine. The Haunter of the Dark refers to entities beyond the furthest star. The Shadow over Innsmouth mentions things from outside. The Dreams in the Witch House describes angles and curves that led off into space. These phrases create cumulative impression of cosmic structures layered beyond human mapping rather than constituting deliberate cosmology with clear hierarchies. The repetition of spatial metaphors, beyond, outside, past, above, suggests extension in directions consciousness cannot literally navigate. Each story adds fragments to larger pattern without explicitly connecting to other stories' fragments, allowing readers to assemble provisional interpretations while preventing definitive synthesis. This distributed mythology building proves more effective than systematic exposition would be because it replicates how ancient mythologies actually developed through accumulation of traditions that suggest, without requiring comprehensive coherence. The unfinished Azathoth fragment gestures toward journey approaching ultimate cosmic source without reaching conclusion, making incompleteness itself significant aspect of text's meaning. Lovecraft writes of a narrator experiencing nightly visions where a faceless guide leads him through abysses whose faintest terrors would freeze the sanity of the firmest philosopher. The fragment describes progressive dissolution of ordinary categories. The solid things of the world became unsubstantial, and geometry breaks down as narrator approaches something his consciousness cannot process. The text breaks off mid-journey, never reaching the destination it describes approaching. This narrative incompleteness mirrors philosophical impossibility of reaching ultimate explanations. The journey toward cosmic source cannot complete because completing it would require consciousness transcending its own conditions. The fragment functions less as failed story than as an acted demonstration that some destinations resist narration, that approaching ultimate reality means approaching point where description itself becomes impossible. Lovecraft's letters reference ultimate chaos beyond his pantheon, indicating conscious construction of cosmology that deliberately exceeds explicit textual elaboration. In 1927 correspondence with August Derleth, Lovecraft mentions the blind idiot god Azathoth, who rules all time and space from his throne at the center of chaos. Yet other letters suggest forces beyond even this characterization, references to nuclear chaos beyond angled space, an ultimate void that seem to extend past Azathoth himself. These extra-textual references demonstrate Lovecraft's awareness of hierarchy problems without definitively resolving them. The letters function as paratext, suggesting depths his published fiction only partially explores, creating impression of mythology larger than any complete textual corpus could contain. Readers knowing these letter references approach published stories with awareness that explicit narratives represent visible portions of larger cosmology. Lovecraft conceived, but never fully articulated, adding depth through suggestion of unexpressed remainder. Cross-textual patterns suggesting infinite cosmic Russian dolls emerge when reading Lovecraft's work comprehensively, with entities mentioned in one story appearing subordinate in another. Cthulhu seems supreme in The Call of Cthulhu, but appears as merely one great old one among others in later work. Nyarlathotep dominates multiple stories through active agency, but gets described as messenger serving higher forces. Even Azathoth, apparently supreme, receives hints suggesting possible forces beyond or beneath it. These patterns prevent cosmology from achieving stable hierarchy because each entity's position proves relative rather than absolute, depending on which text and which perspective frames the reference. The reader assembling comprehensive mythology from scattered texts discovers that comprehensive mythology cannot achieve closure. Each attempt at synthesis reveals gaps, contradictions, suggestions of further levels requiring incorporation. This textual instability replicates cosmic horror's philosophical content, just as consciousness cannot achieve stable understanding of ultimate reality. Readers cannot achieve stable interpretation of Lovecraft's ultimate cosmology because both reality and text, by design, resist stabilization. As we examine specific major stories engaging these themes directly, we must recognize that Lovecraft's distributed mythology building serves philosophical purposes. It doesn't merely entertain through mystery, but rather enacts through narrative structure the epistemological problems cosmic horror explores thematically. Through the Gates of the Silver Key, 1932-1933, co-written with E. Hoffman Price, represents Lovecraft's most direct literary engagement with questions about ultimate cosmic authority and hierarchical structures extending beyond named entities. The story follows Randolph Carter's journey beyond time and space after using the Silver Key to transcend dimensional limitations, seeking reunion with his younger self's wonder, but discovering instead the cosmos's true structure. The narrative frames this exploration through an earthly gathering where Carter's relatives discuss his disappearance, creating distance between cosmic revelations and ordinary consciousness that emphasizes how such knowledge exceeds normal comprehension. Carter's journey takes him through successive veils of reality, each layer revealing itself as provisional, each apparent ultimate proving merely transitional toward deeper understanding. The story's structure mirrors its philosophical content, just as Carter penetrates through surface realities toward fundamental truth. Readers penetrate through narrative frames toward cosmological implications. Lovecraft never fully explicates, but powerfully suggests through accumulated detail. Carter's meeting with Umar at-Tawil, described as the most ancient one and the guide, positions this entity at crucial threshold between comprehensible and incomprehensible reality. Lovecraft writes that Umar at-Tawil appears as a mass of iridescent substance, ever-changing form and color, but always retaining a suggestion of the human, suggesting entity that bridges human categories and cosmic realities, exceeding those categories. The guide functions as interpreter, translator, entity capable of communicating with human consciousness while existing at cosmic scales where human consciousness normally cannot function. Umar at-Tawil tells Carter, "For know you that your gold and marble city of wonder is only the sum of what you have seen and loved in youth, the glory of Boston's hillside roofs and western windows, aflame with sunset." This revelation that Carter's sought destination was always projection, that wonder he pursued existed within rather than beyond, seems initially to resolve quest through internalization. Yet the story immediately transcends this psychological reading by taking Carter further, through Umar at-Tawil, towards something more fundamental than individual consciousness. The revelation of Yog-Sothoth as the all-in-one and one-in-all suggests pantheistic divinity, where ultimate reality equals totality rather than transcendent source beyond totality. Carter learns that he must pass through the ultimate gate to perceive reality's true nature, and beyond this gate, he encounters what the text describes as that last amorphous blight of nethermost confusion which blasphemes and bubbles at the center of all infinity, the boundless demon Sultan Azathoth, whose name no lips dare speak aloud. Yet immediately after this description, Carter experiences something identified as Yog-Sothoth. Carter felt a sudden swirl of unity and eternal wholeness, the sense of being the all-in-one and one-in-all of limitless being and self. The text ambiguously presents whether Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth represent different entities or different aspects of single ultimate reality perceived from different perspectives. If Yog-Sothoth is all in one, nothing exists beyond it by definition. Yet Azathoth receives description suggesting it occupies specific location at infinity's center, rather than being coextensive with everything. The question of whether Yog-Sothoth controls or merely witnesses all existence emerges through Carter's experience of omniscience without omnipotence. As Yog-Sothoth all merged with it, Carter perceives all times and spaces simultaneously. He knew that he had been all things in the limitless past and would be all things in the limitless future. He was all minds and all bodies, male and female, all identities and all races. This suggests consciousness coterminous with all existence, awareness extending through every point in space-time. Yet this awareness does not grant power to alter what is perceived. Carter witnesses but cannot change cosmic processes. The omniscience proves passive rather than active, observation rather than control. If Yog-Sothoth knows everything, yet cannot or does not alter cosmic conditions according to will, then knowledge separates from power in ways that challenge traditional divine attributes. The entity possesses one quality typically ascribed to God, omniscience, without the other, omnipotence, creating theology where supreme consciousness exists without supreme authority. Carter's incomplete understanding and ultimate return demonstrates that even direct encounter with cosmic ultimates cannot grant stable comprehension consciousness can maintain afterward. The story describes how Carter's earthly consciousness cannot sustain the expanded awareness he achieves at cosmic scales. He could not tell which thoughts were his own and which came from the shapeless entity that swam in the primal space. The merging with Yog-Sothoth or Azathoth exceeds what human consciousness can process, leaving Carter with fragmented memories rather than systematic understanding after returning to more limited awareness. The text indicates that Carter ultimately chooses to incarnate in alien form on distant world rather than returning to Earth, suggesting that experiencing cosmic truth makes continued existence within human limitations impossible. Even for consciousness that achieves temporary omniscience, integration of that experience into ordinary awareness proves unattainable. This narrative arc demonstrates Lovecraft's principle that cosmic knowledge cannot be simply acquired and retained. It transforms or destroys consciousness that fully apprehends it. The theological implications embedded in this narrative restructure every conventional religious principle about divine nature and cosmic authority. Traditional monotheism positions conscious God who knows all and controls all, a according to purposes humans can theoretically comprehend, even if they cannot achieve God's perspective. Through the gates of the silver key presents reality where ultimate consciousness exists, Yog Sothoth, but its relationship to ultimate power, Azathoth, remains unclear. Does Yog Sothoth's omniscience include knowing what controls it? And if so, does it discover control by Azathoth, control by physical laws, or absence of control altogether? The story never clarifies, maintaining productive ambiguity about whether cosmos possesses supreme authority or merely possesses supreme awareness without corresponding agency. The theological structure suggests disturbing possibilities, that knowledge and power separate at ultimate levels, that consciousness can be cosmic without being sovereign, that witnessing everything might grant no capacity to determine anything. The story's conclusion raises more questions than it resolves about cosmic hierarchy and control, making narrative incompleteness itself philosophically significant. Carter achieves knowledge beyond human scale, encounters entities at or near cosmic apex, experiences something resembling merger with ultimate reality, yet returns unable to articulate what he learned in terms preserving both accuracy and comprehensibility. The reader receives fragmentary account filtered through multiple narrative frames. Carter's experience, reported through the guide's interpretation, transmitted through Swami Chandraputra, Carter's alien incarnation, to earthly listeners who transcribe partial understanding. This layered narrative distance replicates epistemological distance between ordinary consciousness and cosmic truths. We cannot receive direct report because consciousness receiving direct experience cannot translate it into language ordinary consciousness comprehends. The story thus enacts, rather than merely describing the impossibility of answering who controls the outer gods, demonstrating through narrative structure that the question leads toward experiences exceeding articulation's capacity. As we turn to examine another major text approaching control questions from different angle, we must recognize that Lovecraft's most philosophically ambitious stories succeed not through providing answers, but through depicting consciousness's struggle and ultimate failure to achieve stable answers when confronting realities operating at scales incompatible with human cognitive architecture. The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, one of Lovecraft's final completed stories, approaches cosmic control questions through investigation of artifacts and cults that hint at hierarchies extending beyond immediate entities. The story follows Robert Blake, a writer and occultist living in Providence, who becomes obsessed with investigating an abandoned church on Federal Hill. Blake's research reveals the church once housed the Starry Wisdom Sect, a cult devoted to accessing cosmic knowledge through a peculiar artifact called the Shining Trapezohedron. Unlike Through the Gates of the Silver Key, which depicts direct cosmic encounter, this story operates through documentary accumulation. Blake pieces together cult history, artifact properties, and entity nature through research rather than mystical transportation. The methodological difference proves significant. Where Carter's journey transcended ordinary epistemology through supernatural means, Blake's investigation employs conventional scholarly methods that gradually reveal those methods' inadequacy when facing cosmic realities. The story thus dramatizes how rational inquiry itself breaks down when applied to domains where rationality's categories prove inapplicable. The Shining Trapezohedron serves as window or lens enabling perception of realities normally inaccessible to human consciousness, raising questions about what observation reveals versus what it creates. Lovecraft describes the artifact as a window on all time and space that cultists used to contact entities dwelling beyond normal dimensional frameworks. The trapezohedron's geometry proves impossible by Euclidean standards. It possesses more angles than three-dimensional objects can contain, suggesting it exists partially in dimensions humans cannot directly perceive. When gazed into under proper conditions, the artifact shows terrible vistas of reality, including glimpses of Azathoth and other cosmic entities. The text remains ambiguous about whether the trapezohedron transports consciousness to these entities or merely enables perception of entities always present but normally invisible. This distinction matters philosophically. If artifact creates access, entities might exist independently of human observation. If it merely reveals what was always there, then human ignorance proves protective rather than limiting, and knowledge itself becomes threat rather than achievement. Blake's research uncovers cult documents describing entities beyond the outer gods, in passages suggesting hierarchies extending past named pantheon. He discovers references to Nyarlathotep as the messenger, but messenger between whom and whom remains unclear. One cult document mentions the dweller in darkness serving the demon sultan, but also hints at forces at the rim and the ultimate void in ways suggesting further cosmic layers. The fragmentary nature of these references replicates the fragmentary nature of actual historical texts. Cult documents preserve partial knowledge recorded by humans whose understanding was itself partial, creating multiple layers of incompleteness between Blake and whatever cosmic truths the cult actually encountered. Blake attempts systematic interpretation, treating cult beliefs as data requiring rational explanation, but the documents resist synthesis into coherent cosmology. Each passage that seems to clarify cosmic structure also introduces contradictions or suggestions of further complexities, preventing Blake from achieving stable understanding even as his knowledge accumulates. What Blake glimpses through the trapezohedron and what glimpses him back suggest cosmic forces capable of limited manifestation in earthly dimensions. The entity called the Haunter appears to be avatar or projection rather than cosmic entity appearing in totality. Blake's notes describe experiencing a sense of monstrous, gigantic pulsation and perceiving three-lobed burning eyes when using the artifact. But these sensory experiences represent how entity appears to human perception rather than entity's actual nature. The text indicates that Haunter dwells primarily in darkness and that light prevents its full manifestation, suggesting it exists partially in dimensions where light-dark distinctions operate differently than in terrestrial physics. This limited manifestation points toward larger cosmological principle. Entities occupying scales or dimensions incompatible with Earth's physics can project portions of themselves into our dimensional framework, but cannot fully enter without violating physical constraints. The horror becomes recognizing that even these projections, mere shadows of cosmic entities, prove so alien that human consciousness struggles to process them without dissolution. Providence as setting creates productive tension between prosaic geography and cosmic horror's infinite voids, making the horror more disturbing through proximity. Lovecraft meticulously maps Blake's movements through actual Providence streets, locating the abandoned church at specific coordinates, describing the city's topography with realistic detail. This geographical precision grounds cosmic horror in everyday reality. The artifacts and entities Blake encounters are not sequestered in exotic distant locales, but accessible through ordinary urban exploration. The church sits on Federal Hill, visible from Blake's apartment window. He walks familiar streets to reach it. The shining trapezohedron remained in Providence for decades, potentially accessible to anyone who investigated the abandoned building. This proximity eliminates safe distance between cosmic horror and ordinary life. You cannot dismiss entities as irrelevant to your reality when they occupy the same geographical space you inhabit. The Providence setting also creates temporal layers. Blake investigates 17th and 18th century cult history while living in 1935, connecting contemporary moment to colonial past, suggesting cosmic forces have been accessible through this location across centuries. The death sequence preserves ambiguity about whether Blake saw Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, the Haunter, or projections of forces beyond all named entities. Blake's final diary entries, written during electrical storms that plunged Providence into darkness, describe progressive psychological deterioration and terror of approaching entity. The light is going out. The electricity is all gone. They've cut the wires. I hear a baying sound in the distance. No, nearer. Oh God, the lights are out. I can see the shapes in the dark. They're around me now. They're coming through the walls. The entries break off mid-word, and Blake is found dead, features frozen in expression of absolute horror. The text never definitively clarifies what killed Blake or what he saw in his final moments. Was it the Haunter itself? Nyarlathotep using the Haunter as vessel? Some projection of Azathoth accessible through artifact? Or something else entirely? Forces beyond the naming systems Blake used to organize cosmic hierarchy. The ambiguity proves essential. Definitive identification would domesticate horror by assigning it recognizable place within taxonomy. Uncertainty maintains dread by suggesting Blake encountered something exceeding his conceptual categories. The narrative's documentary structure, assembled from Blake's diary and notes rather than presented as direct narration, emphasizes how cosmic horror's truth remains forever mediated through damaged witnesses. We cannot know what Blake actually experienced because we access his experience only through fragmentary texts written by consciousness already destabilized by what it encountered. His diary entries grow increasingly incoherent as events progress, calling into question reliability of testimony. Did Blake accurately perceive cosmic entities, or did obsession with occult ideas generate delusions that manifested as experiences? The story provides no external verification of supernatural elements, only Blake's accounts and the fact of his death under mysterious circumstances. This unreliability does not negate horror, but intensifies it by suggesting we cannot distinguish between genuine cosmic revelation and psychotic break, between perception of actual entities and projection of fears onto ambiguous stimuli. The reader confronts same epistemological problem as Blake. How do you verify claims about realities that by definition exceed verification's normal methods? The story demonstrates that cosmic control questions resist answers, not only because answers disturb, but because the questions emerge from encounters with realities that compromise consciousness's capacity to think reliably about what it has encountered. As we examine how later authors expanded or distorted Lovecraft's cosmic hierarchy concepts, we must recognize that this story's power derives precisely from maintaining questions Lovecraft knew could not be answered without falsifying what they attempted to address, the fundamental mysteries about whether anything controls cosmos, whether control proves meaningful concept at ultimate scales, and whether consciousness can survive learning whatever truths exist about its own cosmic insignificance. August Derleth's posthumous systematization represents most influential and controversial attempt to resolve cosmic hierarchy ambiguities through imposing clear structure and moral framework. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth positioned himself as literary executor and chief systematizer of what he termed the Cthulhu mythos, organizing scattered entities into coherent pantheon with definite relationships. Most problematically, Derleth introduced the elder gods as benevolent cosmic forces opposing the malevolent outer gods, creating dualistic good versus evil framework entirely foreign to Lovecraft's vision. In The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, supposedly completed from Lovecraft fragments, Derleth writes of the benign elder gods who watch and ward against outer gods' intrusions into our dimension. This theological structure transforms cosmic horror into conventional conflict between opposed forces, suggesting both sides possess consciousness, intention, and capacity for moral alignment. Precisely the anthropocentric projections Lovecraft's work systematically undermined. Where Lovecraft maintained that cosmic entities exist beyond good and evil, operating according to principles incompatible with human moral categories, Derleth reimposed those categories at cosmic scale. The good versus evil cosmology Derleth created provides narrative convenience at enormous philosophical cost by making ultimate cosmic authorities comprehensible and thus less cosmically horrifying. Traditional narratives require protagonists capable of meaningful action, conflicts with stakes that matter, outcomes determinable through characters' choices. Derleth's framework enables these narrative requirements. Human cultists can choose allegiance to elder gods or outer gods. Rituals can summon protective forces or malevolent ones. Cosmic struggle has sides worth supporting. Yet this domesticates cosmic horror's essential insight that the cosmos operates at scales where human actions, choices, and moral frameworks prove utterly irrelevant. If elder gods protect humanity from outer gods, then human existence matters enough for cosmic forces to contest over it, contradicting Lovecraft's fundamental premise of cosmic indifference. If conflict between good and evil extends to ultimate cosmic levels, then familiar moral categories apply universally rather than revealing themselves as provincial constructs. Consciousness imposes on reality, lacking inherent moral structure. Derleth's systematization makes Lovecraft's cosmology manageable precisely by removing what made it horrifying, the suggestion that nothing controls cosmos in ways humans would recognize as control, that hierarchy might extend infinitely without moral organization, that ultimate reality might be blind chaos rather than ordered conflict. The Lurker at the Threshold demonstrates distortion clearly through treating Azathoth as consciously malevolent entity requiring deliberate opposition rather than as unconscious force beyond intention. Derleth writes of cultists attempting to break down the barriers so that Azathoth himself might come through, suggesting entity deliberately seeking entry into our dimension for hostile purposes. This makes Azathoth operate like demon requiring banishment rather than like fundamental cosmic principle requiring no motivation, because it simply is. The novel includes protective formulae, supposedly compelling elder gods to prevent Azathoth's manifestation, creating magical system where cosmic forces respond to human ritual as though they cared about outcomes. One passage describes how the benign elder gods heard and answered, suggesting consciousness, attending to prayers, and choosing intervention. This transforms relationship between humans and cosmic entities from one of absolute incommensurability to one of negotiable exchange. Humans perform correct rituals. Gods provide protection, creating contract where both parties possess agency and mutual comprehensibility. The cosmic control question receives definitive answer. Elder gods control, or at least constrain outer gods, maintaining cosmic order against chaos's encroachment, making ultimate authority conscious, moral, and accessible to human petition. Later writers have taken varied approaches from maintaining Lovecraft's ambiguity to extending Derleth's systematization to attempting recovery of genuine cosmic horror through different routes. Lynn Carter and Brian Lumley embraced elaborate cosmic hierarchies, adding entities above and below Lovecraft's originals, creating detailed cosmologies where every entity occupies defined position. Carter's additions to the mythos included primordial entities preceding even Azathoth, suggesting infinite temporal regression, where each ultimate force proves merely earlier stage in endless succession. Lumley's Titus Crow series features protagonist who actively battles cosmic entities using occult knowledge, transforming cosmic horror into heroic fantasy, where human agency matters and victories remain possible. These approaches prioritize narrative momentum and adventure over philosophical horror, recognizing that sustained storytelling requires protagonists capable of meaningful action, even if that requirement contradicts cosmic horror's principles. Other writers like Ramsey Campbell and Thomas Ligotti maintain Lovecraftian ambiguity, avoiding systematic answers to hierarchy questions while exploring cosmic horror through contemporary settings and psychological depth. Their work suggests that asking who controls the outer gods preserves horror better than answering it does. Role-playing games face unique challenges in adapting cosmic hierarchy because gameplay requires clear mechanics, while cosmic horror requires productive uncertainty. Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu RPG 1981 must provide statistics for entities, rules for magical systems, and structured frameworks enabling gameplay, all of which risk domesticating what should remain alien. The game attempts balance through treating outer gods as effectively infinite in mechanical terms. Azathoth receives statistics indicating it automatically destroys any character who encounters it directly, making confrontation mechanically impossible rather than merely difficult. This preserves some horror through enforced inaccessibility. Players cannot fight ultimate cosmic forces, only navigate around them or attempt preventing their manifestation. Yet the game still implies hierarchical structure through relative power levels, with great old ones being beatable with sufficient preparation, while outer gods remain forever beyond player characters' capacity to affect. The mechanical necessity of providing systematic cosmology for game master reference creates tension with cosmic horror's philosophical commitment to ambiguity about cosmic structures. Some gaming groups resolve this by treating official cosmology as in-character beliefs rather than objective truth, allowing game world scholars to provide systematic hierarchies while acknowledging those hierarchies might misrepresent realities humans cannot adequately conceptualize. Modern fiction writers approaching cosmic control questions often foreground epistemological and existential dimensions while avoiding false clarity about cosmic structures. Caitlin R. Kiernan's fiction explores consciousness struggling with cosmic knowledge without requiring definitive cosmology, focusing on psychological effects of encountering realities that exceed comprehension rather than cataloging those realities systematically. Laird Barron's stories feature cosmic forces operating according to agendas humans cannot fathom, maintaining Lovecraft's vision of radical alterity without attempting to map ultimate hierarchies. These contemporary approaches recognize that effectiveness of who controls the outer gods as horror-generating question depends on never receiving satisfying answer. The question works by creating vertigo, by suggesting infinite regressions or category errors, by making consciousness confront its own inadequacy when attempting to think cosmic ultimates, answering definitively, whether answer is nothing controls them, or elder gods control them, or mathematical necessity controls them, domesticates by providing closure, by allowing consciousness to categorize and file away, rather than remaining unsettled by permanent uncertainty. The tension between explanation and mystery reveals fundamental incompatibility between narrative requirements and cosmic horror's philosophical commitments, a problem Lovecraft himself never fully resolved. Stories require some clarity about cosmic structures to function narratively. Characters need enough understanding to pursue goals. Readers need enough information to follow developments. Narrative resolution requires some determination of outcomes. Yet cosmic horror's philosophical power derives from maintaining that ultimate reality exceeds human understanding, that clarity about cosmic structures represents falsification through excessive anthropomorphization, that consciousness cannot achieve stable knowledge about conditions of its own existence. Lovecraft navigated this tension by providing enough systematic reference to enable stories while maintaining sufficient ambiguity to prevent closure. His best work balances revelation and obscurity, giving readers enough to grasp narrative while denying enough to prevent comprehensive understanding. Later authors who tip balance toward full explanation create more readable stories at expense of philosophical horror. Those who tip toward complete obscurity create more philosophically rigorous work at expense of narrative engagement. Perhaps the lesson is that cosmic hierarchy, questions like who controls the outer gods, function best as permanently open inquiries rather than puzzles admitting solutions, not because authors cannot imagine answers, but because the horror consists precisely in recognizing that our need for answers reflects cognitive limitation rather than achievable goal, that the question itself reveals consciousness, projecting anthropocentric frameworks onto realities that should resist those frameworks, and that the most honest approach to cosmic ultimates might be acknowledging that asking who controls already falsifies by presuming control operates at levels where the concept proves meaningless or fundamentally misleading. As we turn to examining cosmic hierarchies' cultural afterlife beyond literature, we must recognize that Lovecraft's reluctance to definitively answer control questions was not artistic failure, but rather sophisticated recognition that some questions cannot be answered without betraying what they attempt to address. Occultists claiming contact with entities above the outer gods represent recurring pattern where practitioners treat Lovecraft's fictional cosmology as revealing actual metaphysical truths requiring extension beyond textual canon. Online forums devoted to chaos magic and left-hand path practices regularly feature accounts of rituals supposedly accessing levels beyond Azathoth, encountering forces the practitioner describes as the nameless mist, or the darkness at the center, or other evocative titles suggesting hierarchies extending past Lovecraft's explicit mythology. These claims typically acknowledge Lovecraft as source, while insisting his fiction contained intuitive truths about actual cosmic structures. One recurring narrative involves practitioners reporting that meditation or ritual induced experiences of infinite regress, encountering entity after entity in ascending hierarchy without reaching terminus, generating existential crisis. The practitioner then interprets as genuine contact with cosmic reality's actual structure. Whether these experiences reflect genuine anomalous phenomena, psychological effects of intensive ritual practice, or creative myth-making becomes impossible to determine, and perhaps the ambiguity itself proves significant, replicating cosmic horror's epistemological uncertainty within practitioner communities. The Simon Necronomicon, 1977, presents itself as translation of Lovecraft's fictional grimoire, while containing elaborate hierarchical cosmology, mixing Mesopotamian mythology with Lovecraftian entities. The text describes ancient ones dwelling beyond dimensional boundaries, provides invocations supposedly enabling contact with these forces, and crucially, suggests these entities answer to still deeper principles it calls the Ancient of Days and the Forgotten Ones. The book's authors never clearly explain whether this represents sincere belief, artistic creation, or deliberate hoax. The text maintains studied ambiguity about its own ontological status. Chaos magic practitioners have particularly embraced the Simon Necronomicon, not because they necessarily believe its historical claims, but because they find its symbolic system psychologically effective for inducing altered states. Within chaos magic philosophy, whether entities really exist matters less than whether treating them as real produces desired psychological effects. This pragmatic approach to cosmic horror's cosmology creates interesting recursion. Lovecraft invented entities to explore philosophical problems about consciousness and reality. Practitioners use Lovecraft's inventions as tools for exploring consciousness and reality. The distinction between invention and discovery blurs when inventions function effectively enough to seem like discoveries. Online revelations about true cosmic hierarchy proliferate on forums devoted to occult topics and cosmic horror, with users proposing increasingly elaborate systems, positioning familiar entities within vaster structures. Reddit's r/r occult and various Discord servers feature regular discussions where participants propose that Azathoth represents not ultimate reality, but rather our universe's Azathoth, suggesting multiple Azathoths governing separate dimensional frameworks, themselves subject to meta-Azathoth or other organizing principle. Some propose that Yog-Sothoth occupies position analogous to Gnostic Pleroma, with Azathoth as demiurge figure and still higher, true, ultimate beyond both. These speculative cosmologies typically acknowledge their debt to Lovecraft while treating his work as incomplete revelation requiring elaboration. The communities constructing these systems operate somewhere between fiction writing, theology, and collaborative world building. Participants simultaneously recognize they're engaging with fiction and treat that fiction seriously enough to warrant systematic expansion. This ambiguous engagement mirrors cosmic horror's own ambiguity about boundaries between human projection and cosmic truth, between invented frameworks and discovered structures. Conspiracy theories asking who really controls Lovecraft's gods emerge periodically online, treating cosmic hierarchy as puzzle requiring detective work to solve. Some theorists propose Lovecraft received actual revelations through dreams or other means, encoding genuine cosmic truths within fiction as protective cover. Others suggest secret societies possess knowledge about true cosmic hierarchies Lovecraft referenced but never fully explained. These conspiracy frameworks typically operate through pattern finding across Lovecraft's texts and letters, identifying supposed hidden messages or coded references, revealing true answers to hierarchy questions. QAnon-style interpretative strategies appear in these communities. Cryptic statements receive elaborate decoding. Ambiguities become clues to hidden meanings. Absence of evidence becomes evidence of concealment. While these conspiracy approaches are intellectually unsupportable as claims about actual cosmic structures, they reveal something psychologically significant. Humans strongly resist accepting that certain questions cannot be answered, that some ambiguities reflect genuine indeterminacy rather than concealed certainty. The conspiracy theorist reimposes order on cosmic horror, specifically designed to resist ordering, making explicit what should remain implicit, solving mysteries whose unsolved status constitutes their point. Channeled entities claiming authority over or knowledge about cosmic hierarchy appear in New Age and occult contexts, with mediums reporting contact with beings who supposedly explain ultimate cosmic structures. Some channeled messages describe the Council of Seven governing outer gods, or the primordial light from which all entities emerge, or various other organizing principles. These revelations typically domesticate cosmic horror by reintroducing familiar spiritual frameworks. Consciousness precedes matter. Love represents ultimate force. Cosmic evolution progresses toward enlightenment. The channeled cosmologies almost always position human consciousness as spiritually significant rather than cosmically irrelevant, directly contradicting Lovecraft's vision of radical cosmic indifference. Yet these channeling narratives demonstrate persistent human need for cosmic structures that validate human meaning-making rather than invalidate it. Even when engaging with Lovecraft's deliberately disturbing cosmology, consciousness apparently cannot help reimposing reassuring frameworks, finding ultimate love or consciousness where texts insist on ultimate blindness and mechanism. The psychology of needing cosmic order, even horrifying order, reveals how deeply consciousness depends on hierarchical frameworks for making sense of reality. Humans evolved in environments requiring recognition of dominance, hierarchies, causal chains, and ordered relationships to navigate social and physical worlds successfully. We apply these pattern-finding and hierarchy-detecting capacities promiscuously, seeing agency where none exists, finding order in randomness, imposing structure on chaos. The question, who controls the outer gods, emerges from this deep cognitive tendency. We cannot easily conceive of power without authority, of forces without governing principles, of cosmic operations without cosmic operators. Even Lovecraft, attempting to create mythology of cosmic meaninglessness, could not escape using language implying hierarchy, control, and organization. His entities receive titles like Sultan and Lord, get described in relational terms like messenger and guide, occupy positions like throne, suggesting governmental structure. Language itself, evolved for describing human social hierarchies, may lack resources for articulating realities operating without hierarchical organization. The cultural persistence of hierarchy questions around cosmic horror suggests not merely that audiences misunderstand Lovecraft's vision, but that consciousness structurally requires imposing hierarchical interpretations, even when intellectually convinced such interpretations falsify. Why people want to believe in cosmic control structures, even terrible ones, points toward deep psychological need for ordered universe that exceeds desire for happy universe. Research in psychology of religion demonstrates humans often prefer harsh but ordered cosmos over kindly but chaotic one. Belief in judgmental God who punishes transgressions causes less anxiety than believing in random universe where suffering lacks meaning. This extends to cosmic horror. Discovering Azathoth rules provides disturbing order, but order nonetheless superior psychologically to discovering no one rules and nothing means anything. The cosmic control question persists culturally because answering it, even with horrifying answer, satisfies cognitive need for structure, while leaving it unanswered generates ongoing anxiety consciousness finds difficult to tolerate. Some audiences engage cosmic horror specifically to experience vertigo of permanent uncertainty in controlled context, inoculating themselves against existential anxieties through voluntary exposure. Others seek definitive answers whether Lovecraft provided them or not, projecting resolution onto texts deliberately designed to resist resolution. Both responses reveal that cosmic hierarchy questions tap into fundamental tensions between consciousness's need for order and reality's apparent indifference to that need, making who controls the outer gods not just literary question, but psychological and existential one that continues disturbing because it forces confronting whether ultimate reality possesses structure, consciousness can comprehend, or whether cosmos operates according to principles forever exceeding human cognitive architecture's capacity to adequately represent. Film's need for clear antagonists conflicts fundamentally with cosmic ambiguity about ultimate authority and control structures that resist visual representation or narrative resolution. Cinema operates through showing rather than suggesting, requiring entities to possess visual form that cameras can capture and audiences can perceive. Yet cosmic hierarchy questions derive power precisely from remaining suggested rather than shown, implied rather than explicit. Early Lovecraft adaptations, like Roger Corman's work, largely avoided cosmic entities entirely, focusing on psychological horror and human corruption rather than attempting to visualize outer gods or explain their relationships. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, approaches control questions obliquely through meta-narrative about fiction affecting reality. Characters discover they exist within horror novel being written, raising question of whether author controls characters or merely transcribes what must occur according to story's logic. The film never resolves this authorial control question, mirroring unresolvability of cosmic control questions. Does narrative determinism require determiner, or does story simply unfold according to its own internal necessities? More recent films attempting direct cosmic horror tend to fail precisely where they provide too much clarity about cosmic structures domesticating through excessive explanation. Video games have achieved remarkable success exploring control questions through mechanics that systematically remove player agency while maintaining enough gameplay to function. Bloodborne, 2015, begins as action game where player seemingly controls outcomes through skill, but narrative progressively reveals player character exists within cosmic hierarchy extending far beyond initial appearance. The game introduces Great Ones as apex predators, then reveals Great Ones themselves operate within constraints they cannot escape. They cannot reproduce successfully, creating existential crisis for beings possessing vast power. The optional ending, where player character transforms into infant, Great One, suggests even apparent transcendence merely continues cycle without escaping it, that achieving ultimate power provides no ultimate freedom. This mechanical and narrative structure translates cosmic horror's hierarchy problems into gameplay. You gain power throughout game, defeat increasingly mighty entities, apparently ascend toward cosmic sovereignty, only to discover sovereignty itself proves illusory, that every level of cosmic hierarchy operates within constraints established by forces the game never definitively explains. The insight mechanic makes this epistemological. Accumulating forbidden knowledge changes what you perceive, but also increases vulnerability, suggesting knowledge provides no advantage and perhaps constitutes disadvantage when confronting realities consciousness cannot process safely. Board and card games create structured systems for engaging hierarchy questions, while acknowledging those questions resist definitive resolution through mechanical implementation. Arkham Horror and Eldritch Horror position various ancient ones as existential threats players must prevent from awakening, with Azathoth specifically designed as an unwinnable scenario. If Azathoth awakens, the game immediately ends in universal defeat, regardless of players' preparations. Yet even these games cannot fully represent hierarchy's infinite recession. They must assign definite power levels, establish clear victory conditions, provide mechanical frameworks allowing gameplay. The game's solutions typically involves treating outer gods as beyond direct confrontation while making their servants and cultists manageable opponents. This creates gameplay where players engage with cosmic forces indirectly, attempting to delay inevitable rather than achieve permanent victory. Some scenarios include mechanics where investigating too deeply causes madness or attracts entity attention, translating forbidden knowledge themes into mechanical costs for pursuing certain strategies. The cooperative nature of these games also reflects cosmic horror's implications. Facing threats that dwarf individual capacity requires collective effort, yet collective effort ultimately proves insufficient against forces operating at scales beyond human influence. Players experience through gameplay the philosophical problem cosmic horror explores textually. They cannot win against ultimate forces, only temporarily forestall manifestation, making every victory provisional and every defeat eventually inevitable. Music across genres has found cosmic hierarchy's themes adaptable to sonic experimentation that can suggest infinite recession and controls absence through purely auditory means. Drone and dark ambient artists like Lustmord create soundscapes suggesting vast spaces and alien geometries without requiring visual representation or narrative explanation. These compositions use sustained tones, subsonic frequencies, and spatial audio processing to generate a sense of immensity and insignificance. the listener becomes aware of sound extending beyond hearing's capacity to fully process, of vibrations felt rather than heard, of acoustic spaces too large for human scale. Death metal bands like Portal and Ulcerate employ musical techniques that deconstruct conventional song structures. Tempo becomes unstable, harmony dissolves into controlled noise, rhythmic patterns refuse resolution into clear meter. These sonic choices mirror cosmic horror's philosophical content, suggesting order breaking down, familiar structures becoming alien, progression without destination. The music doesn't tell stories about cosmic hierarchies, but rather creates auditory experiences paralleling consciousness's disorientation when confronting realities exceeding its organizational categories. Some compositions specifically attempt translating Lovecraft's descriptions into sound. The thin piping of demon musicians becomes sustained high-frequency drones. Azathoth's chaos becomes layered dissonance and polyrhythmic complexity. Visual artists confront Azathoth and cosmic hierarchy through techniques emphasizing negative space, impossible geometries, and visual representations of infinity that camera-based media struggle to achieve. Abstract expressionists and digital artists working in Lovecraftian modes often avoid depicting entities directly, instead showing effects of their presence, distortions in surrounding space, impossibly angled shadows, colors that shouldn't exist within the visible spectrum, suggested through unexpected combinations. Some artists employ fractal geometry to suggest infinite recession, patterns repeating at every scale, self-similar structures extending toward infinity, visual representations of mathematical concepts, like strange attractors or Julia sets that hint at order emerging from chaos through processes admitting no conscious ordering principle. The most effective visual approaches recognize they cannot show cosmic hierarchy definitively, but can suggest it through composition, placing recognizable elements at edges while leaving vast central spaces empty or filled with visual noise, suggesting something unpresentable, creating tension between what appears and what remains implied. These strategies translate cosmic horror's literary techniques into visual grammar. The most significant element is precisely what cannot be shown, and successful representation consists in making absence present through its effects on surrounding elements. The commercialization of existential dread transforms cosmic hierarchies, philosophical problems into aesthetic choices and merchandise that signals subcultural affiliation without requiring genuine engagement. You can purchase t-shirts declaring Cthulhu for president, or displaying Azathoth imagery, treating entities embodying cosmic meaninglessness as ironic fashion statements. This commodification arguably domesticates horror by making it consumable, comfortable, something you wear rather than something that disturbs. Yet commercial spread also serves function of disseminating ideas to wider audiences who might not seek philosophical fiction. The person wearing cosmic horror merchandise encounters the basic concepts: reality's instability, consciousness's contingency, authority's possible meaninglessness, even if they encounter them initially as aesthetic rather than philosophical problems. Some argue commercialization represents cultural metabolism, how societies process and neutralize disturbing ideas by making them familiar through repetition. Others suggest commerce actually extends ideas' reach beyond academic or literary contexts where they might remain sequestered. The tension between domestication and dissemination remains unresolved, with cosmic horror simultaneously becoming less threatening through familiarity and more culturally pervasive through commercial spread. Successful versus failed adaptations across media reveal pattern. Works succeeding maintain epistemological uncertainty while adapting form to medium-specific capabilities, while failures attempt direct translation of textual techniques that don't transfer or provide false clarity, contradicting cosmic horror's philosophical commitments. Film succeeds when using visual techniques to suggest rather than show, lighting that obscures more than it reveals, editing creating temporal disorientation, sound design generating unease through infrasonic frequencies. Audiences feel more than hear. Games succeed when mechanics embody rather than merely narrate cosmic horror's themes. Sanity systems where knowledge becomes liability. Progression revealing increased vulnerability rather than increased power. Victory conditions showing themselves provisional against infinite cosmic time. Music succeeds when generating effective states paralleling philosophical content rather than attempting programmatic depiction. Visual art succeeds through acknowledging limitations, making inability to represent become part of representation's meaning. The pattern suggests cosmic hierarchy questions translate across media only when adaptations recognize they cannot answer questions, but can create experiences, making audiences feel cognitive vertigo such questions generate. Asking who controls the outer gods works differently in each medium, but works best when maintaining questions' disturbing openness rather than imposing medium-specific closure that text wisely avoided. As we turn to examining how academic and subcultural communities have appropriated cosmic hierarchy concepts, we must recognize that successful transmission across contexts requires finding ways to preserve philosophical disturbance while accommodating each context's particular constraints and possibilities, maintaining tension between consciousness's need for order and cosmos's resistance to ordering that makes control questions perpetually compelling, despite, or precisely because, they resist resolution. Philosophers have increasingly engaged cosmic horror as legitimate subject for continental philosophy discussions, particularly within existentialist, nihilist, and speculative realist frameworks examining consciousness's relationship to being. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, treats Lovecraft's cosmology as serious philosophical intervention rather than mere fiction. Arguing cosmic horror articulates the world without us, reality existing independently of human consciousness and potentially continuing after consciousness's extinction. Thacker positions the question of cosmic control as central to horror philosophy. If reality operates according to principles incompatible with consciousness, asking who controls reveals anthropocentric category error, projecting human organizational frameworks onto cosmos that organizes, if it organizes at all, according to alien principles. Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology employs Lovecraft to explore how entities relate to each other rather than merely to human consciousness, suggesting cosmic hierarchies might represent objective relationships between objects operating at scales where human categories prove inadequate. These philosophical appropriations treat cosmic horror not as entertainment requiring willing suspension of disbelief, but as literature posing genuine metaphysical problems about consciousness, existence, and the possibility of thinking realities exceeding thought's categories. Academic legitimation transforms pulp fiction into proper subject for rigorous analysis, Though some argue this domestication through academic respectability removes precisely the disreputable strangeness that made cosmic horror effective. Theological debates invoke outer gods to discuss monotheism versus cosmic horror's anti-theism, using Lovecraft's hierarchy problems to explore whether coherent concept of ultimate authority can exist. Traditional monotheism positions single God as ultimate authority, requiring no external cause, possessing aseity, self-sufficient existence, making further explanation unnecessary. Cosmic horror systematically challenges every aspect of this theological framework. Azathoth occupies God's structural position, but lacks consciousness. Yog-Sothoth possesses divine omniscience without divine power or care. Hierarchy potentially extends infinitely without reaching unmoved mover. Theologians have noted that Lovecraft's cosmos creates negative theology, more radical than traditional apophatic approaches, where negative theology describes God through what he is not while maintaining he exists. Lovecraft's cosmology suggests ultimate reality might be literally nothing, blind chaos, or infinite regress, admitting no stable foundation. Some Christian apologists argue Lovecraft's vision demonstrates why monotheism remains necessary. Without ultimate conscious authority, hierarchy becomes either infinite regress, violating parsimony, or terminates in mindless force, violating sufficiency. Others suggest cosmic horror exposes monotheism's anthropocentric presumptions, revealing our need for cosmic authority figure as projection rather than perception. The theological engagement demonstrates control questions possess genuine religious and philosophical stakes beyond fictional entertainment. Physics provides framework for interpreting what controls the outer gods through asking whether mathematics itself constitutes ultimate cosmic authority operating deterministically without requiring consciousness. Mathematical Platonists argue that mathematical structures exist independently of physical instantiation, with physical reality obeying mathematical laws because those laws possess ontological priority over matter. Under this interpretation, equations governing quantum mechanics, relativity, thermodynamics don't describe what exists, but rather determine what can exist. Mathematics controls physics, which controls chemistry, which controls biology, extending through every hierarchical level. The outer gods would then represent mythological personifications of mathematical principles, Azathoth as maximum entropy, Yog-Sothoth as space-time manifold, Nyarlathotep as transformation operator. What controls them is mathematical necessity itself, which requires no controller because it simply describes logical relationships that must hold given mathematics' axiomatic foundations. Yet this raises further question. What controls mathematics? Do axioms require justification through meta-mathematics, extending infinitely, or do they represent bedrock requiring no further foundation? The parallel to Lovecraft's cosmic hierarchy proves exact. Whether mathematics or Azathoth occupies ultimate position, same problems about infinite regress versus arbitrary terminus emerge, suggesting these aren't merely fictional puzzles, but genuine metaphysical dilemmas consciousness faces when pushing explanation toward ultimate levels. Systems theory and cybernetics offer distributed control models where order emerges without central authority through feedback loops and self-organization. Complexity science demonstrates how patterns arise spontaneously from interactions between components following simple rules. No component controls overall pattern, yet pattern exhibits coherence and stability. Applied to cosmic horror's hierarchies, this suggests apparent control might represent emergent property rather than exercised authority. Azathoth doesn't control cosmic forces. Rather, Azathoth and other entities constitute mutually constraining system where each element's behavior depends on and influences others, creating stable patterns without requiring central command. The demon musicians piping around Azathoth then represent not servants, but complementary forces maintaining dynamical stability, like how predator-prey populations mutually regulate without either species controlling the ecosystem. This cybernetic reading eliminates controller-controlled relationships in favor of reciprocal causation and circular feedback, suggesting hierarchy is observational artifact rather than ontological feature. Yet this interpretation still leaves unresolved what established systems' parameters. Why these feedback relationships rather than others? Why these stability conditions rather than alternatives? The control question recurses: who or what controls the metasystem, determining how subsystems can organize? Political theory employs cosmic horror's hierarchy questions to explore sovereignty's foundations and whether ultimate political authority can exist or inevitably requires further justification. Carl Schmitt's concept of the sovereign as he who decides on the exception parallels Azathoth's position, supreme through occupying structural apex rather than through legitimate authority grounded in consent or reason. Yet Schmitt's sovereign possesses consciousness and decision-making capacity Azathoth lacks, raising question: can sovereignty exist without consciousness, without will to decide? Anarchist political philosophy finds in Lovecraft's cosmology metaphor for critiquing all hierarchical authority. If cosmic hierarchy either extends infinitely, infinite regress, or terminates arbitrarily, Azathoth's mindless rule, then political hierarchies similarly lack ultimate justification, resting finally on force or accident rather than legitimate authority. The cosmic horror reading suggests all claims to ultimate authority represent unjustified power disguised through mystification, ideology making contingent dominance appear necessary order. Yet others note that even Lovecraft's explicitly non-hierarchical chaos generates patterns consciousness interprets as hierarchical, suggesting humans might be constitutionally incapable of organizing without imposing or perceiving authority structures, regardless of whether such structures possess objective foundation. Psychology examines projection of human power structures onto cosmos as revealing fundamental cognitive operations that shape how consciousness interprets all relationships, including those at cosmic scales. Terror management. Theory explores how awareness of mortality drives humans to create cultural worldviews, providing meaning and structure, with cosmic hierarchies functioning psychologically to impose comprehensible order on existence, otherwise characterized by meaningless contingency. Lovecraft's cosmology disturbs because it activates these terror management mechanisms, presenting elaborate hierarchical structures, satisfying need for order, while simultaneously subverting them through suggesting hierarchies lack conscious foundation or moral organization. Studies in pattern recognition demonstrate how readily humans see agency and intentionality in random or mechanical processes, a tendency so strong that even explicit knowledge about randomness fails to eliminate agentive interpretation. Applied to cosmic horror, this suggests the question, who controls the outer gods, emerges inevitably from consciousness's pattern-finding operations, even when intellectually convinced control represents projection rather than perception. The psychological research validates Lovecraft's insight that horror derives not from supernatural entities, but from consciousness, recognizing its own cognitive limitations, its inability to think outside categories that systematically misrepresent realities exceeding human organizational capacities. Why academics across disciplines find the control question genuinely difficult rather than easily dismissible, as fictional puzzle reveals how Lovecraft's cosmology engages real metaphysical problems under fantastic disguise. Philosophers debate infinite regress versus foundationalism, with neither position achieving consensus despite centuries of analysis. Physicists argue about whether mathematics describes or prescribes physical reality, whether laws of nature require lawgiver, whether fundamental constants possess deeper explanation. Theologians dispute whether necessary being can exist, or whether existence requires no foundation. Lovecraft's question, who controls the outer gods, is not separate from these academic debates, but rather literary formulation of same problems professionals struggle to resolve through technical philosophy, physics, and theology. The fictional framing arguably illuminates rather than obscures genuine difficulties. By removing debate's technical obscurity, cosmic horror lets audiences directly experience cognitive vertigo that technical discussions generate in specialists. The persistent academic interest suggests Lovecraft successfully translated abstract metaphysical problems into narrative form that makes those problems psychologically immediate rather than merely intellectually challenging, demonstrating that cosmic hierarchy questions remain compelling across scholarly contexts because they engage genuinely unresolved issues about reality's ultimate structure, whether explanations must terminate somewhere or extend infinitely, and whether consciousness can achieve stable understanding of cosmic foundations or whether such understanding exceeds human cognitive architecture's fundamental capabilities. As we turn to examining enduring psychological and philosophical implications, we must recognize that subcultural and academic appropriations don't merely analyze cosmic horror from external perspective, but rather demonstrate how deeply control questions penetrate diverse areas of human inquiry, suggesting these questions touch something fundamental about consciousness's relationship to reality that transcends fictional origins. The horror of infinite regress, turtles all the way down, generates a specific form of existential dread that differs from confronting simple meaninglessness through its suggestion of endless deferral rather than absence. When we learn that each cosmic authority answers to higher authority, extending infinitely without terminus, we face not void, but rather structure that refuses to ground itself. Traditional nihilism argues existence lacks inherent meaning, which disturbs but remains conceptually manageable. We acknowledge absence and either despair or construct provisional human meanings. Infinite regress creates different problem. Apparent structure, promising foundation that perpetually recedes as we approach it. Explanation that requires explanation, requiring explanation without end. This generates cognitive exhaustion rather than simple emptiness. We cannot stop seeking foundation because consciousness operates through seeking grounds for beliefs and structures, yet infinite hierarchy guarantees foundation remains forever inaccessible. The psychological effect resembles climbing staircase, where each landing reveals another staircase above, or solving puzzle, where each solution presents new puzzle, creating frustrated teleology, purposeful striving that can never achieve its purpose because achievement would require completing infinite task. Some philosophers argue infinite regress proves less disturbing than arbitrary terminus, but psychological research suggests humans find endless deferral more anxiety-producing than definitive absence, versus the horror of no regress, nothing controls anything, which dissolves cosmic structure entirely into mechanistic chaos, operating without authority, governance, or principle that could justify calling it order. If outer gods operate deterministically, according to physical laws, admitting no exceptions, and physical laws themselves require no explanation beyond mathematical description of how matter energy behaves, then control becomes meaningless category. Nothing controls because control requires controller, entity exercising authority over processes, yet processes simply occur according to their nature without anyone controlling them. This removes even the structure infinite regress provides. Instead of endless chain of authorities, we discover no authority exists at any level. That apparent hierarchy masks uniform mechanism where all entities, however powerful, simply execute operations determined by forces that themselves execute operations, turtles all the way through rather than down. The psychological implications differ from infinite regress because they eliminate seeking's object. There is nothing to find, no foundation to reach, no explanation that would satisfy, because satisfaction requires explanatory terminus that doesn't exist. Some find this liberating through removing false hope of ultimate understanding, but most experience it as vertigo of groundlessness, standing on nothing while that nothing pretends to be something stable enough to support reality's weight. Both answers equally disturbing. Ultimate authority or ultimate chaos suggests cosmic horror's effectiveness derives from placing consciousness between irresolvable alternatives rather than from either option individually. If ultimate authority exists, then vast consciousness or principle governs cosmos according to purposes, yet those purposes remain so alien that from human perspective they might as well be random. We exist within governed universe, but governance serves ends incompatible with or indifferent to everything consciousness values, making cosmic sovereignty actively threatening through its very intentionality. If ultimate chaos exists, then no governance occurs at any scale. Existence emerges accidentally from blind forces, and human meanings float on void, admitting no foundation, making existence itself contingent accident rather than necessary feature of reality. Neither option provides consolation. Conscious cosmic authority that doesn't care proves as disturbing as unconscious cosmic chaos that cannot care. The psychological bind consists in recognizing we cannot know which disturbing option obtains, or whether both represent false alternatives obscuring third option more disturbing still. Lovecraft's genius lay in maintaining both possibilities simultaneously through strategic ambiguity, preventing resolution into either alternative, and thus preventing psychological adjustment to whichever cosmic structure actually exists. Why humans need to believe in control, even cosmic horror's control, reveals deep psychological dependence on hierarchical frameworks that exceeds preference for happy outcomes. Studies in developmental psychology show children naturally organize social world hierarchically, perceiving dominance, relationships, and authority structures from early age. This tendency appears cross-culturally and possibly reflects evolutionary adaptation. Hierarchies reduced social conflict in ancestral environments by establishing clear precedents without requiring constant competition, and recognizing authority figures helped children navigate social worlds where compliance brought advantages. We extend these cognitive operations beyond social domain, perceiving hierarchies in nature, predator-prey relationships, organizations, corporate and governmental structures, and cosmos itself, religious hierarchies of angels, demons, gods. The cosmic control question emerges from this deep cognitive bias toward hierarchical organization. We cannot easily think without imposing or perceiving authority structures, even when intellectually convinced such structures are projections. This explains why audiences persistently seek answers to who controls the outer gods, despite Lovecraft's careful maintenance of ambiguity. The question reflects cognitive necessity more than fictional curiosity, deep psychological need for ordered universe where power flows through comprehensible channels, even if those channels prove horrifying. The comfort of distant, incomprehensible masters versus the terror of none points toward how human psychology prioritizes structure over content when organizing existential understanding. Research in terror management theory demonstrates that cultural worldviews providing meaning and structure reduce anxiety more effectively than views offering pleasant but chaotic cosmologies. People tolerate harsh but ordered belief systems, judgmental gods, strict moral codes, difficult but comprehensible cosmic principles, better than they tolerate pleasant but disordered ones. Lovecraft's outer gods provide structure. There are entities, there are relationships between them. There appears to be hierarchy, even if its exact configuration remains unclear. This structured uncertainty proves psychologically preferable to complete uncertainty where not even entities' existence or relationships can be confidently asserted. The distant incomprehensibility paradoxically comforts through suggesting that answers exist even if humans cannot access them. Somewhere in cosmic structure, control relationships actually obtain, even though those relationships exceed human comprehension. The alternative, that no control relationships exist at any scale, that cosmos operates without organizational principle, consciousness could recognize as organization, generates more severe dread by eliminating even the possibility of eventual understanding. Modern anxieties about control find expression through cosmic hierarchy frameworks, providing vocabulary for contemporary powerlessness in political, technological, and environmental domains. Climate collapse demonstrates humanity confronting consequences of systems initiated but no longer controlled, processes that will continue regardless of collective will to alter them. Technological acceleration through artificial intelligence development raises questions about whether creators control creations or whether sufficiently complex systems escape originating intentions. Political complexity, where decisions emerge from interactions between countless actors without any individual or group exercising meaningful control over outcomes, creates a sense of systemic determination without determinants. Lovecraft's cosmos provides metaphor for these contemporary situations. We exist within systems too complex for comprehensive understanding, influenced by forces operating at scales dwarfing individual or collective agency, subject to processes that appear both organized and uncontrolled simultaneously. The question, who controls the outer gods, translates to contemporary, who controls global systems, and receives similarly unsatisfying answers. either infinite regress of influences, corporations controlled by markets, controlled by consumer behavior, controlled by cultural forces, controlled by historical contingencies, extending indefinitely, or recognition that no one controls anything, that apparent control represents post hoc rationalization of emergent patterns no agent intended or directs. Lovecraft's question remains relevant as whether ultimate reality possesses structure, consciousness can comprehend, or whether cosmos operates according to principles forever exceeding human cognitive architecture's capacity to adequately represent. Cognitive science suggests that human conceptual structures evolved for navigating social environments and medium-scale physical objects, not for representing quantum mechanics, cosmic scales, or ultimate metaphysical principles. Our intuitions prove systematically misleading when extended beyond evolutionary relevant domains. We cannot intuitively grasp quantum superposition, special relativity's implications, or mathematical infinities despite these representing best current understanding of physical reality. If our cognitive architecture systematically misrepresents reality at scales evolution didn't prepare us for, then perhaps asking who controls reveals not cosmic truth, but rather cognitive limitation. We frame questions through control frameworks because those frameworks worked in ancestral environments, but they might fundamentally misrepresent how reality actually operates at ultimate levels. The enduring relevance consists not in answering control questions, but in recognizing that our compulsion to ask them, our inability to think without hierarchical and agentive categories, might represent permanent epistemological constraint that makes ultimate cosmic truth perpetually inaccessible to consciousness structured as human consciousness is structured. The final twist. What if the shocking answer is that the question is malformed, transforms cosmic horror from puzzle requiring solution into meditation on consciousness's limitations when confronting its own cosmic situation? Perhaps, who controls the outer gods commits category error, like asking what color numbers are or how much justice weighs, grammatically correct, but conceptually confused, applying predicates to subjects where those predicates cannot meaningfully apply. Control might be concept applicable only within certain scales and contexts, breaking down when extended to cosmic ultimates the way Newtonian physics breaks down at quantum scales. If so, then every proposed answer, mathematical necessity, infinite regress, unconscious chaos, conscious deity, falsifies through presuming control exists to be explained. The truly shocking answer might be recognizing we cannot stop asking malformed questions because consciousness cannot function without categories revealed as inadequate. We are trapped seeking foundations. Consciousness cannot help seeking, yet cannot find, because the seeking itself imposes structure on what has no structure, projects hierarchy onto what admits no hierarchy, imagines control where perhaps no such thing exists or can exist. This makes cosmic horror ultimately reflexive. The horror consists not in what exists cosmically, but in consciousness discovering its own incapacity to think truthfully about existence, its imprisonment within categories that systematically falsify what they attempt to represent. Living with cosmic uncertainty means accepting we may never know who or what controls the outer gods, not because the answer is hidden, but because consciousness asking the question might be constitutionally incapable of framing it in ways admitting meaningful answers, making permanent uncertainty not provisional state awaiting resolution, but rather fundamental condition of consciousness, attempting to comprehend cosmic principles that generated consciousness as accidental byproduct, without concerning themselves with whether that consciousness could eventually understand its own origins, operations, or ultimate cosmic context within which it briefly and contingently exists.